Brianna twisted the 2-carat diamond on her finger and smirked. "The only wedding gift I want is for you to disappear from this family forever. You do not fit our aesthetic." I stood in the foyer of the sprawling colonial estate I secretly purchased to save them from bankruptcy. My mother, Sylvia, took a slow sip of champagne. "Listen to your sister. Your plain little life is an absolute embarrassment to Trenton's family." My father, Warren, did not even lift his gaze from his glowing phone screen. He just nodded. "Pack your bags tonight. We have a reputation to maintain." They truly believed I was a disposable corporate drone. They had absolutely no idea that as a senior title, insurance underwriter, I already possessed the forged documents proving they stole $1.5 million against my property to fund this wedding. So, I gave them exactly what they demanded. I disappeared. But before I vanished, I legally sold the estate out from under them, froze their stolen wedding funds, and left a single leather folder in the empty living room that would guarantee they traded their designer wedding attire for federal prison jumpsuits. Have you ever had to permanently cut ties with toxic relatives who only valued you for what they could steal? Let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button to see exactly how this execution unfolded. My father, Warren, poured a heavy measure of aged scotch into a crystal tumbler, the ice clinking sharply against the thick glass. He stood beside the carved mahogany fireplace of our sprawling colonial estate, adjusting the stiff cuffs of his tailored dress shirt. At 60 years old, he flawlessly projected the aura of a commercial real estate titan. He possessed the rigid posture, the commanding baritone voice, and the styled silver hair of a man accustomed to dominating boardrooms. He did not possess a single dime of actual equity. 10 years ago, Warren's regional development firm collapsed completely under a crushing mountain of toxic debt. Creditors relentlessly circled the property. Foreclosure notices piled up daily on the marble entryway table. Sylvia, my 58-year-old mother, spent those agonizing weeks locked inside the master bedroom, refusing to face the impending public humiliation of losing her elite social status. I stepped into the breach. I did not offer emotional platitudes or empty comfort. I offered capital, utilizing the 6-figure salary I earned. I quietly purchased the deed to the estate directly from the holding bank. I deliberately structured a blind trust, shielding my name from the public county records, allowing my parents to remain in the home without suffering the indignity of eviction. They never once acknowledged the transaction. They simply resumed hosting their country club dinners and charity galas, treating me not as their financial savior, but as a silent, inconvenient tenant who reliably paid their utility bills. I accepted the silence. I thrive in the cold, calculated spaces where hard numbers replace volatile emotions. I operate as a senior title insurance underwriter. While my corporate peers hunt for praise and promotions, I hunt for discrepancies. I sit in a secure high-rise office in Manhattan, methodically dismantling complex property fraud. I trace hidden offshore accounts, expose fraudulent shell companies, and unearth buried liens that arrogant investors attempt to hide. I read digital footprints and banking anomalies the way other people read facial expressions. My mind operates like a steel trap, filtering out the chaotic noise and isolating the pure, unadulterated facts. When you spend your days dissecting the intricate lies people construct to steal commercial real estate, you learn to spot a grifter from a mile away. You also learn exactly how to build an impenetrable fortress around your own assets. My parents, however, viewed my career as a tedious, embarrassing joke. To them, I was just a glorified clerk pushing paper across a laminate desk. They equated true success with flash, with loud, aggressive displays of purchased prestige. My younger sister, Brianna, operated as the ultimate manifestation of their delusion. At 28 years old, she possessed no career, no retirement savings, and absolutely no concept of reality. She spent her days aggressively curating a pristine, aristocratic persona for her digital followers. She paraded through the colonial estate I legally owned, treating my antique furniture and manicured gardens as mere props for her daily photo shoots. She treated me like an annoying member of the household staff. "Move out of the frame," Brianna snapped one Tuesday evening, waving a manicured hand dismissively in my direction. I stood near the kitchen island, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. She adjusted a bright ring light stationed in the center of the room, angling her camera lens to capture the sweeping grand staircase behind her. "You are ruining the aesthetic. Go sit down in the basement if you want to read those boring spreadsheets." I did not argue. I did not remind her whose name secured the roof over her head. I picked up my laptop, walked silently down the hall, and closed the heavy oak door to my study. I watched her broadcast her fabricated life, projecting an image of generational wealth sustained entirely by my grueling 80-hour work weeks. The family dynamic shifted from quietly toxic to entirely unbearable the night Brianna brought Trenton home. Trenton strode through the heavy oak front doors wearing a custom charcoal suit and a permanent, arrogant smirk. At 32 years old, he represented the third generation of a notoriously corrupt local commercial development dynasty. He exuded the restless, aggressive energy of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted without facing a single consequence. Warren and Sylvia practically tripped over themselves to greet him in the foyer. Sylvia rushed forward, taking his expensive wool coat, her voice pitching up a full octave as she showered him with excessive, fawning compliments. Warren poured a fresh glass of top-shelf scotch, handing it to Trenton with a deferential, eager nod. They worshipped his last name, desperate to hitch their sinking wagon to his established real estate empire. Brianna lifted her left hand, flashing a diamond ring the size of a marble. They announced their engagement, and the foyer erupted in manufactured, theatrical joy. Trenton leaned casually against the mahogany banister, swirling his amber drink. He scanned the room, his eyes finally landing on me. I stood quietly near the dining room archway, wearing a simple navy blazer and practical slacks. "And you must be the sister," Trenton drawled, looking me up and down with undisguised boredom. "Brianna tells me you crunch numbers for a living. Sounds thrilling." "It pays the bills," I replied, my tone flat and entirely devoid of emotion. Warren scoffed loudly, stepping quickly between us to shield his future son-in-law from my lack of charisma. "Amy prefers the background. Trenton, she lacks the vision for actual high-level development now. Let us discuss your new commercial plaza downtown." The wedding planning consumed the household like a ravenous parasite. Brianna demanded imported orchids, a 5-star catering staff, and a custom designer gown sourced directly from Europe. The projected costs soared rapidly into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, Sylvia cornered me in the formal dining room. I sat at the long mahogany table, reviewing a thick stack of title deeds for a corporate client. Sylvia slapped a glossy, leather-bound wedding ledger onto the polished wood, deliberately covering my legal documents. "We need to discuss your financial contribution," she announced, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I slowly lowered my silver pen, keeping my breathing perfectly regulated. "My contribution?" "Brianna is marrying into an elite family," Sylvia stated, her tone sharp, entitled, and uncompromising. "Trenton's parents expect a massive spectacle. Warren's liquidity is temporarily tied up in his new commercial investments. You have sat on a massive corporate salary for years while living here rent-free. It is time you step up and fulfill your familial duty." She demanded I drain my personal savings to fund an exorbitant, superficial party. She stood in the very house I rescued from absolute ruin, barking orders, entirely oblivious to the fact that I held the ultimate deed to the floorboards beneath her expensive heels. I looked down at the glossy ledger, then up at her demanding, entitled expression. A lesser woman would have exploded. A lesser woman would have screamed the truth, thrown the secret trust documents onto the table, and demanded immediate respect and gratitude. I did none of those things. I slipped my silver pen back into my blazer pocket, maintaining a perfectly impassive glacial mask. I let the silence stretch, compressing the intense frustration deep inside my chest, locking it away behind a wall of pure logic. "I will review the numbers," I said quietly. Sylvia scoffed, snatching the heavy ledger back off the table. "Do not just review them, Amy, pay them. Try to be useful to this family for once in your life. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning filled my Manhattan office, a stark contrast to the chaotic gridlock of the city streets 20 floors below. I sat perfectly centered behind a sleek glass desk, my eyes scanning the cascading lines of data across 3 illuminated monitors. My workstation served as the nerve center for my daily operations, a highly secure terminal where I dissected complex property transfers and authorized multi-million-dollar title policies. A sharp metallic chime shattered the quiet concentration of the room. A red notification banner flashed across my primary screen. It did not originate from my corporate email or a client portal. The alert triggered from a proprietary monitoring algorithm I had discreetly installed years ago within the county clerk's digital registry. I built the script to monitor a single, specific asset, the blind trust holding the deed to the colonial estate my parents occupied. I set my ceramic coffee mug onto a cork coaster. I dragged my cursor over the red banner and clicked. The screen transitioned, populating a raw digital filing extracted directly from the municipal database. A new lien had registered against the property exactly 48 hours ago. I leaned forward, my eyes tracking the sterile, black and white text of the legal encumbrance. The document outlined a massive line of credit secured by the equity of the estate. The principal amount glared back at me, $1.5 million. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. The estate was fully paid off. I held the original deed in a fireproof safe. No bank could legally authorize a 7-figure loan against the property without the explicit, notarized consent of the primary title holder. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, bypassing the public-facing summary and accessing the back-end portal to extract the raw PDF scans of the master loan agreement. The file downloaded instantly. I opened the document, scrolling past the standard amortization schedules and liability waivers, driving straight toward the final page. The borrower signature line materialized on the screen. I highlighted the digital ink and magnified the image by 400%. The signature spelled out my full legal name. The ink looped and slanted with terrifying precision, mimicking the exact pressure points and cursive structure I utilized on my official documents. It was a flawless visual forgery. Directly beside the forged signature rested a digital notary stamp, certifying the physical presence and identity of the signer. I copied the license number embedded in the stamp and ran a secondary query through the state regulatory database. The search returned a match within seconds. The notary commission belonged to an independent contractor registered to a defunct commercial warehouse on the edge of the city. I cross-referenced the warehouse address against the municipal tax records. The property belonged to a subsidiary holding firm owned entirely by Trenton's family. I released the mouse. I leaned back into the ergonomic mesh of my chair. The chaotic noise of the Manhattan traffic below seemed to completely evaporate, leaving me suspended in an absolute, suffocating vacuum. I did not gasp. I did not reach for my smartphone to dial the authorities. A normal person would have panicked, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the theft. But I operate in the cold, unforgiving realm of financial forensics. The emotional shock bypassed sorrow entirely, crystallizing into a glacial, razor-sharp focus. My parents did not simply insult my wardrobe or belittle my career. They crossed the terminal threshold into severe federal criminality. They committed aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and bank fraud. I needed to see the underlying architecture of their betrayal. I opened a secure backdoor channel utilizing my firm's executive credentials, penetrating the underwriting files of the secondary commercial lender that approved the loan. The raw application data flooded my secondary monitor. Warren and Sylvia possessed the credit score of a sinking ship. They lacked the verifiable income to finance a luxury vehicle, let alone a 7-figure line of credit. The bank underwriters completely ignored my parents' financial history. Instead, the application was anchored entirely to my personal Social Security number, my pristine credit score, and my immaculate corporate tax returns. My parents had systematically raided my old filing cabinets stored in their basement. They harvested my foundational identification documents, packaged my decade of grueling 80-hour work weeks, and weaponized my spotless financial stability to serve as phantom collateral. I pulled the disbursement schedule from the underwriting file to track the liquidity. The lender released the funds in 2 distinct tranches. The first transfer moved exactly $500,000 into a domestic escrow account. I traced the routing node to an elite event planning syndicate based in the city. Warren and Sylvia had instantly liquidated $500,000 of stolen equity to secure Brianna's imported orchids, her custom European dresses, and her 5-star catering staff. They financed her entire aristocratic delusion by quietly placing a financial noose around my neck. But the wedding did not account for the remaining funds. I extracted the transaction hash for the second transfer. The bank wired the remaining $1 million into a blind corporate shell entity registered in Delaware. I deployed a tracing algorithm to penetrate the corporate veil of the shell company. The data peeled back layer by layer until the ultimate beneficiary materialized on my screen. The tax identification number mapped directly to a stalled, heavily leveraged commercial development project registered to Trenton. The truth locked into place like the heavy steel gears of a bank vault. Trenton was not a thriving real estate titan. He was drowning in toxic commercial debt. His projects were failing, and his creditors were circling. He recognized Warren's desperate need for social validation and manipulated his future father-in-law into executing a catastrophic federal crime. Warren forged my signature. Trenton supplied the corrupt notary to bypass the legal safeguards, and they split the stolen $1.5 million to artificially inflate their respective sinking empires. They constructed their entire arrogant reality on a foundation of my stolen identity. They knew that when the massive monthly payments inevitably defaulted, the commercial lender would instantly initiate foreclosure proceedings. The bank would seize the colonial estate. My pristine credit would shatter. My corporate firm, discovering a defaulted 7-figure loan tied to my name, would terminate my employment and revoke my underwriting licenses immediately. Warren, Sylvia, Brianna, and Trenton knew the blast radius of this fraud would permanently annihilate my future. They evaluated my life, calculated my borrowing power, and willingly sacrificed my existence to buy a few months of fake prestige. I stared at the illuminated screens, watching the digital cursor pulse in the silence of my office. They expected me to play the role of the oblivious, obedient daughter. They assumed I would simply absorb the ruin, too embarrassed and broken to fight back against a towering wall of debt. They drastically underestimated the psychological fortitude of a woman who dismantles financial lies for a living. My jaw locked. My hands rested flat against the cool glass surface of the desk. The remaining tether of familial loyalty snapped, dissolving into ash. I closed the underwriting portal and minimized the forged documents. I did not need to scream or cry. I simply needed to prepare for war. I disconnected from my secure terminal, packed my leather briefcase, and navigated the subterranean transit back to the sprawling colonial estate. Engaging in a screaming match would yield absolutely zero tactical advantage. Narcissists weaponize confrontation. They thrive on chaotic escalations, utilizing raw emotion to twist reality and project their own guilt onto the victim. I refused to grant them a single ounce of that leverage. I pushed through the heavy oak front doors and proceeded directly toward the kitchen. I tied a linen apron around my waist, extracted a chef's knife from the butcher block, and systematically diced vegetables for a roast. Warren and Sylvia occupied the marble island, swirling vintage red wine in heavy crystal goblets. Brianna sprawled across the velvet living room sofa, aggressively scrolling through her phone, loudly demanding specific imported peonies from a frantic florist. I curved my lips into a polite, hollow smile, sliding a platter of charcuterie toward my parents. Warren barely registered my presence. He continued a pompous lecture regarding the surging commercial market, praising Trenton's fabricated business acumen. I drove the steel blade through the cutting board, maintaining a perfectly regulated respiratory cadence. I absorbed their suffocating arrogance without dropping my docile facade. While the roast baked, I excused myself, bypassing the powder room to slip quietly into the utility closet stationed beneath the grand staircase. The primary broadband router hummed softly on a high shelf, surrounded by tangled Ethernet cables. Warren frequently boasted about managing the estate's network, bragging to his country club associates about his top-tier cybersecurity. In reality, He lacked the basic competence to change the default administrative factory password. I pulled my corporate smartphone from my pocket and logged directly into the network backend. I bypassed the standard user interface, diving straight into the deep connection logs. I set a query for the specific date and timestamp associated with the forged digital signatures on the commercial loan application. The terminal flashed, populating the results instantly. The router captured the exact outbound data packets originating from Warren's personal laptop. I exported the raw IP logs, securing the undeniable digital footprint that placed my father directly behind the keyboard during the exact minute the bank received the fraudulent notarized deed. I saved the encrypted file to my secure cloud server, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and returned to the kitchen to carve the roast. The estate finally settled into a deep, ignorant silence shortly after 2 a.m. I sat locked inside my home office, the room illuminated only by the harsh, pale glare of my dual monitors. The emotional detachment was absolute. I launched my proprietary forensic auditing software, the exact suite I utilized to untangle multinational corporate embezzlements. I fed the compromised bank routing numbers into the tracing algorithm. The software generated a visual map of the transaction history, rendering the stolen capital as glowing red nodes branching across the dark screen. It systematically dissected the movement of the $1.5 million. The first tranche, $500,000, bounced from the initial domestic escrow account and splintered into a dozen different offshore wire transfers. I tracked the terminal nodes across the globe. The stolen equity landed in the overseas accounts of luxury event planners, Italian silk merchants, and private charter aviation companies. Warren effectively converted stolen capital into unrecoverable international wedding deposits to purchase Brianna's aristocratic illusion. The remaining $1 million followed a much darker, aggressively convoluted path. Trenton did not leave the capital resting in a vulnerable domestic bank. He routed the funds through a blind corporate entity registered in Delaware, a classic obfuscation tactic designed to wash illicit capital. I pierced the corporate veil, deploying a script that matched the employer identification numbers against public tax registries. The shell company operated merely as a holding pen. Trenton funneled the stolen million directly into the toxic debt portfolios of his collapsing commercial development projects. He utilized the cash to temporarily silence aggressive creditors and halt impending foreclosures. They elevated their actions from simple grifting to severe federal wire fraud and international money laundering. Trenton actively scrubbed illicit funds through a dummy corporation, while Warren knowingly authorized the fraudulent transfers across state lines. The Federal Bureau of Investigation builds entire careers on cases possessing a fraction of this evidence. I opened a new encrypted digital vault on my hard drive. I began dragging the extracted files into the repository. I compiled the forged PDF scans, the metadata pinpointing the forgery timeline, the home router IP logs, and the comprehensive transaction hashes proving the money laundering. I structured the folders with the clinical, merciless precision of a federal prosecutor drafting a grand jury indictment. I titled the parent folder with a random string of alphanumeric characters and transferred the entire dossier onto a ruggedized, offline external hard drive. I unplugged the drive, feeling the dense weight of the metal casing resting in my palm. The weapon was fully assembled, loaded, and locked. The next morning, I descended the staircase and watched my family congregate in the foyer. They laughed loudly, admiring imported fabric swatches and toasting their impending high society status with morning mimosas. They operated with the blind, intoxicating arrogance of predators who firmly believed they had successfully consumed their prey. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and offered them a warm, encouraging smile. They had absolutely no idea I was silently engineering the guillotine for their entire false empire. The wedding week descended upon the colonial estate like a hostile military occupation. By Tuesday morning, a fleet of commercial delivery trucks commandeered the long gravel driveway. Teams of frantic florists hauled massive wire frames through the heavy oak doors, constructing towering arches of imported white roses and cascading orchids in the grand foyer. Catering crews invaded the industrial kitchen, shouting orders and slamming stainless steel prep tables against the tile floors. The quiet, structured sanctuary I purchased to save my parents from ruin completely evaporated, replaced by an asphyxiating labyrinth of frantic, high society preparation. I navigated the chaos like a phantom. I yielded the hallways to event planners carrying clipboards and sidestepped workers, rolling racks of tailored garments. I retreated to the periphery, silently observing the frenetic consumption fueled entirely by my stolen identity. Brianna established her command center in the formal living room. She pushed my antique mahogany furniture against the walls to create a sprawling staging area for her bridal wardrobe. She operated with the unchecked tyranny of a monarch, barking demands at anyone who crossed her line of sight. On Wednesday afternoon, Trenton's mother and two sisters arrived for a final gown fitting and a catered champagne luncheon. They swept into the foyer wearing pristine designer trench coats, their wrists heavy with platinum jewelry. Brianna stood on a velvet pedestal in the center of the living room, draped in layers of custom European silk. She spotted me walking past the archway, carrying a stack of files from my home office. "Amy," Brianna snapped, her voice echoing sharply over the ambient chatter. She did not ask, she commanded. "Go to the kitchen, fetch the espresso carafe, and bring a fresh tray of macaroons for Patricia." I paused. I looked at her standing on the pedestal, radiating manufactured aristocratic superiority. And then I looked at Trenton's mother, who surveyed me with an expression of mild distaste. I wore a simple charcoal wool skirt and a practical white blouse. I lacked the visible brand logos they required to register a person as human. "Look at her," Brianna scoffed, gesturing toward me with a flick of her wrist. She turned to her future mother-in-law, offering an exaggerated sigh. "She wears that drab corporate uniform every single day. I keep telling her to invest in a stylist, but she simply lacks the pedigree for high fashion. She blends right into the wallpaper." Trenton's sisters let out a synchronized, breathy laugh. I did not clench my jaw. I did not drop my files. I turned on my heel, walked into the chaotic kitchen, and prepared the silver tray exactly as demanded. I carried the porcelain cups and the pastries back into the living room, placing them gently onto the glass coffee table. "And grab the commercial steamer from the hallway," Brianna ordered, pointing toward a rack of bridesmaid dresses. "The chiffon on the emerald gowns is wrinkled. Press them before you go back to your spreadsheets." I picked up the heavy, water-filled tank of the steamer. I pressed the heated metal nozzle against the delicate fabric, watching the thick white plumes of steam rise into the air. The heat radiated against my face, a physical manifestation of the searing frustration building inside my chest. I dragged the nozzle down the length of the gown, smoothing the creases, absorbing the humiliation. Every sneer, every burst of laughter at my expense compressed the psychological spring tighter. I accepted the subjugation. I let them treat me like a hired servant, fully aware that I held the digital execution order that would obliterate their entire reality. The subjugation continued to escalate. Later that evening, Warren and Sylvia intercepted me at the base of the grand staircase. Sylvia reached out and pinched the fabric of my cardigan, her face twisting into a severe scowl. "The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow," Sylvia stated, her voice dropping into a harsh, hushed reprimand. "And the main reception follows on Saturday. We have senators, elite commercial developers, and prominent socialites arriving at this house." Warren stepped closer, towering over me, projecting his false patriarchal authority. "You will remain out of sight, Amy. You will not mingle during the cocktail hour, and you will absolutely not attempt to engage Trenton's family in conversation." "Your father is right," Sylvia added, crossing her arms. "You possess absolutely no understanding of their world. You lack the vocabulary for their tax brackets. We cannot risk you boring a prominent investor with stories about your tedious desk job. When the guests arrive, you vanish. Understood?" They stood inside the foyer I owned, dictating where I was permitted to walk. They utilized the $1.5 million they stole from my name to purchase the very guests they deemed me too inferior to speak with. I lowered my chin, adopting a posture of total defeat. "I understand," I replied, my voice perfectly hollow. "I will stay in the background." Warren nodded. adjusting his silk tie with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "See that you do. We have a legacy to protect." I retreated to the kitchen, seeking a momentary reprieve from the suffocating arrogance. The catering crew had packed up for the night, leaving the stainless steel counters gleaming and the room smelling faintly of roasted garlic and expensive truffles. I filled a glass with ice water and leaned against the granite island, regulating my heart rate. The heavy swing door pushed open. Trenton strode into the kitchen. He had just returned from a bachelor excursion with his groomsmen. He removed his tailored suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over the back of a dining chair, and loosened his collar. He moved with the heavy, unbothered stride of a man who believed the world existed solely to cater to his desires. He bypassed me entirely. Opening the liquor cabinet to retrieve a bottle of aged bourbon, he poured a generous measure into a glass, took a long sip, and finally turned to acknowledge my presence. He leaned against the counter opposite me, crossing his ankles, a patronizing, predatory smirk spread across his face. "You always hide in the kitchen, Amy," Trenton asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Or do you just enjoy watching other people live their lives?" I gripped the cold glass of water. "I prefer the quiet." Trenton chuckled, a low, arrogant sound that grated against my nerves. Quiet is for people who lack the vision to make noise. He took another sip, his eyes roaming the expansive kitchen. Take this estate, for example. Warren sat on this equity for years doing absolutely nothing. A stagnant asset. It takes a certain kind of ruthless intellect to unlock dead capital and put it to work. He was actively bragging to me about the massive federal bank fraud he committed using my forged signature. The sheer, unadulterated hubris was breathtaking. "Liquidity is just a game, Amy." Trenton continued, manspreading slightly, projecting dominance in my physical space. "The banks, the underwriters, the regulators, they build all these little walls to keep the average citizen locked out. But a true visionary knows how to bypass the red tape. You just have to know how to move the capital across the board before the system even registers the play." He genuinely believed he was a mastermind. He believed he had outsmarted the lending institutions and secured a hidden lifeline for his toxic commercial debt. He had absolutely no idea that a senior title insurance underwriter had already penetrated his Delaware shell company, traced his illegal routing numbers, and compiled a master dossier destined for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Trenton stepped closer, closing the distance until I could smell the heavy bourbon on his breath. He leaned over the granite island, towering over me. "You ever want more than this, Amy?" he mocked softly, staring down at my simple clothing. "Just pushing papers across a desk, following the rules while the rest of us build empires." I looked up, meeting his arrogant gaze. I did not step back. I placed my hands flat against the cold marble countertop. I locked away the raging inferno of my hatred, channeling it into a calm, icy stare. "I imagine building empires takes a lot of creative leverage, Trenton," I said, ensuring my voice remained perfectly steady, laced with just enough submission to satisfy his ego. "I prefer to stick to the rules. It keeps things predictable." Trenton laughed aloud, shaking his head in profound pity. "Predictable. That is exactly the word for you. Amy, completely, entirely predictable." He pushed off the counter, grabbed his bourbon, and walked out of the kitchen without a second glance. I stood alone in the silence. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the psychological spring compress to its absolute, maximum tension. They believed they were apex predators. They believed they had successfully consumed my resources, isolated my existence, and secured their unassailable, aristocratic future. I picked up my glass of ice water, raised it toward the swinging door Trenton had just exited, and took a sip. Let them bask in their untouchable arrogance for one more day. The trap was primed, the evidence was secured, and the execution was officially underway. Exactly 4 days remained until the ceremony. The atmosphere inside the estate had morphed into a suffocating, hyper-pressurized vacuum. The relentless parade of vendors, florists, and event coordinators temporarily ceased, leaving a rare, heavy silence echoing through the halls. I walked through the heavy oak front doors, carrying my leather briefcase after a 10-hour shift at the underwriting firm. I rolled my shoulders, attempting to release the deep, muscular tension locked across my upper back. I stepped onto the hand-laid mosaic tiles of the grand foyer. They waited for me. The staging was entirely deliberate. Brianna stood at the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase, positioned perfectly under the crystal chandelier to catch the light. Sylvia occupied a velvet accent chair to her left, resting a crystal champagne flute against her knee. Warren leaned against the carved wooden banister to her right, his thumbs rapidly striking the screen of his smartphone. They formed a unified, impenetrable front. I stopped in the center of the foyer, gripping the handle of my briefcase. I looked at the three of them, waiting for the inevitable demand. Brianna stepped forward, closing the distance between us. She crossed her arms, pushing her shoulders back. She twisted the 2-carat diamond on her finger and smirked, her upper lip curling into a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. "The only wedding gift I want is for you to disappear from this family forever," Brianna stated, her voice slicing through the quiet foyer. "You do not fit our aesthetic." I did not flinch. I kept my breathing slow and measured, analyzing her posture. Brianna paced a slow semicircle around me, eyeing my practical wool slacks and simple cotton blouse. Trenton's family booked the entire country club for the rehearsal dinner tomorrow. They invited state senators and international developers. We hired an entire media team to document the weekend. I refuse to let my photographers capture you, lingering in the background like a displaced administrative assistant. You drag down the pedigree of this entire event. Sylvia lifted her crystal flute, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage champagne. She swallowed, adjusting the heavy pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. "Listen to your sister," Sylvia commanded, her tone laced with absolute elitist disgust. "Your plain little life is an absolute embarrassment to Trenton's family. We spent months cultivating this alliance. We finally secured our position in the upper echelon of this city. You possess no ambition. Amy, you lack the grace and the vocabulary to engage with our guests. Your mere presence invites unwanted questions about our lineage." I shifted my gaze to my father. Warren did not even lift his head. He continued typing an email, his jaw clenched in a tight, arrogant line. "Pack your bags tonight," Warren ordered, his deep baritone reverberating off the high ceiling. He did not look at me. He treated me with the detached irritation a CEO reserves for a malfunctioning piece of office equipment. "We have a reputation to maintain. We cannot risk you engaging a prominent investor in a tedious conversation about your desk job. Have your belongings out of this house by tomorrow morning. Go book a room at a commercial hotel downtown." He finally pressed send on his phone, locking the screen and slipping the device into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He met my eyes, projecting a cold, uncompromising authority. "You are completely disinvited from the rehearsal dinner and the wedding reception. Do not attempt to contact us. Do not attempt to bypass the security team at the venue. We will reach out to you after Brianna and Trenton return from their honeymoon in Europe." I stood paralyzed on the mosaic tiles. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of their ambush washed over me, a freezing wave that extinguished the final, microscopic ember of my familial loyalty. They stood in the center of the foyer I legally owned. They banished me from the house I secretly purchased to save them from a humiliating public foreclosure. They utilized the $1.5 million they stole through severe federal wire fraud to purchase the champagne Sylvia currently sipped, the designer suit Warren currently wore, and the social status Brianna currently weaponized against me. They constructed their towering, arrogant empire entirely on the back of my stolen identity, and now they sought to erase me from the narrative entirely. They evaluated my existence, calculated my total utility, drained my borrowing power to the absolute limit, and casually threw me into the incinerator. I looked at Brianna's smug, triumphant smile. I observed Sylvia's dismissive eye roll. I analyzed Warren's impatient, authoritative stance. A lesser woman would have shattered. A lesser woman would have dropped her briefcase, fallen to her knees on the hard tile, and begged for their love. A lesser woman would have screamed the truth, thrown the secret trust documents in their faces, and demanded the respect she fundamentally deserved. I locked those impulsive, chaotic reactions deep inside a psychological vault. I operate in the realm of cold, calculated leverage. Screaming matches provide narcissists with ammunition. Confrontation grants them the opportunity to gaslight, manipulate, and twist the narrative into a web of manufactured victimhood. I refuse to hand them a single shred of power. Instead, I lowered my chin. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine to project a posture of total, crushing defeat. I released my grip on my briefcase slightly, letting it sag against my leg. I forced my breathing to hitch, mimicking the shallow, frantic rhythm of a woman suppressing a violent sob. "If that is what you want," I whispered, keeping my vocal cords tight, ensuring my voice sounded fragile, broken, and entirely compliant. Brianna let out a sharp, victorious laugh. She turned away from me, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "It is exactly what we want. Ensure your room is completely spotless before you leave. The bridal party needs the extra space for hair and makeup on Saturday morning." Sylvia set her empty champagne flute onto the mahogany entryway table with a definitive click. "Do not make this a tragedy, Amy. It is a simple matter of optics. We will send you a link to the professional photo gallery next month." Warren turned his back to me, grasping the wooden banister and ascending the stairs without offering a single word of farewell. He discarded his oldest daughter with less consideration than he afforded a crumpled receipt. I stood in the foyer alone. The heavy silence rushed back into the space, filling the void they left behind. I lifted my head. The feigned fragility instantly evaporated from my posture. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back until my vertebrae popped. I gripped the leather handle of my briefcase with a firm, unyielding strength. They believed they just won the ultimate victory. They believed they successfully excised the final, embarrassing blemish from their pristine, fabricated reality. They thought they discarded a helpless, obedient victim who would quietly absorb the impending financial ruin generated by their defaulted commercial loans. They failed to calculate the strategic catastrophe they just authorized. By aggressively evicting me from the estate, they inadvertently removed the only obstacle hindering my counterattack. I no longer needed to hide my digital audits in the dead of night. I no longer needed to tiptoe past their bedrooms to access the broadband router. I no longer needed to mask my cold fury behind a polite, docile smile at the dinner table. They handed me an open, unrestricted operational window. They granted me complete physical isolation. I turned away from the grand staircase and walked steadily toward my bedroom. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mourn the family I lost, because the family I thought I possessed never actually existed. They were merely parasites, and they had just willingly detached themselves from the host. I pulled a heavy canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet. I did not pack my extensive wardrobe. I bypassed the sweaters, the slacks, and the practical blouses. I walked directly to my hidden floor safe. I spun the combination dial, hauled the heavy steel door open, and extracted my essential documents. I grabbed my passport, my original birth certificate, the physical deed to the colonial estate, and the ruggedized external hard drive containing the master dossier of their federal crimes. I shoved the items into the canvas bag and zipped it shut with a sharp, decisive pull. The psychological anchor severing me from my past officially dropped away. I carried the bag down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. I did not look back at the antique furniture or the imported floral arrangements. I walked out the heavy oak front doors, pulled them shut behind me, and locked the deadbolt. The execution phase was officially authorized. I descended the brick steps of the colonial estate, my leather loafers crunching sharply against the manicured gravel driveway. I did not break character. I maintained the stoic, defeated posture they expected, allowing my shoulders to sag under the weight of my canvas duffel bag. I paused near the driver's side door of my sedan and cast a brief, hesitant glance toward the expansive living room window. Sylvia stood behind the glass, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her silhouette illuminated by the towering crystal chandelier. She turned away before I even inserted my key into the ignition. She dismissed my entire existence without a second thought. The illusion of my humiliating retreat solidified perfectly. I navigated the winding suburban roads, merging onto the interstate leading toward downtown Manhattan. The suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the estate evaporated, replaced by the rhythmic, steady hum of the tires against the cold asphalt. I watched the sprawling, fake aristocratic mansions fade in my rearview mirror, yielding to the brutal, efficient steel grid of the city skyline. The physical distance mirrored the internal shift within my mind. I stripped away the persona of the obedient, invisible daughter, leaving only the hyper-rational underwriter. I bypassed the boutique hospitality venues featuring velvet lounges and fawning concierges. I required absolute, sterile anonymity. I pulled into the subterranean garage of a towering glass and steel business hotel favored by international executives. I approached the reception desk, sliding a premium titanium corporate card across the polished granite counter. I bypassed the standard accommodations, securing an executive corner suite on the 40th floor. I swiped the magnetic keycard. The heavy, solid-core door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a pristine, minimalist sanctuary. The suite smelled faintly of ozone and citrus cleaner. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the glittering urban grid below. I did not unpack my clothing. I tossed my wool coat over a leather armchair and immediately unzipped the canvas duffel bag. I transformed the glass dining table into a forensic command center. I extracted my primary laptop, a secondary ruggedized tablet, and the heavy external hard drive containing the master dossier. I connected the encrypted network cables, intentionally bypassing the hotel's vulnerable broadband infrastructure. I routed my signal through a proprietary virtual private network, masking my digital location entirely. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across my face. I launched a secure, end-to-end encrypted video communication terminal. I initiated a direct connection to Evelyn. Evelyn operated as a senior partner at a ruthless corporate litigation firm. At 45 years old, she possessed a mind like a diamond, flawless, impenetrable, and capable of cutting through the most fortified legal defenses. She built her career as a federal prosecutor before transitioning to the private sector, specializing in dismantling complex financial syndicates. She despised parasites, and she operated with a lethal, terrifying precision. The connection established with a crisp chime. Evelyn appeared on the screen, sitting in her mahogany-lined office, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. She did not bother with pleasantries. "Amy," Evelyn stated, her tone sharp and clinical. "I decrypted the data packet you transmitted yesterday. The evidence is staggering." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass table. Warren forged my signature. He secured a $1.5 million line of credit against the estate utilizing a corrupt notary provided by Trenton. Evelyn pulled a printed ledger into the frame, tracing the lines of data with a gold pen. I tracked the disbursement algorithms. Warren liquidated $500,000 to domestic event vendors. He effectively washed the capital through florists, caterers, and custom tailors. She flipped the page, her expression hardening. But Trenton escalated the liability. He routed the remaining $1 million through a Delaware shell entity. He absorbed the stolen equity to temporarily stall foreclosures on his toxic commercial debt. "They colluded," I said, pulling up the matching IP logs on my secondary monitor. "Warren authorized the transfer. Trenton provided the laundering vehicle." Evelyn removed her glasses, tapping the frames rhythmically against her desk. "They committed aggravated identity theft, severe bank fraud, and federal wire fraud. The Delaware transfer triggers interstate commerce statutes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will tear their lives apart the second we submit this dossier." "I need the federal complaints drafted," I instructed, my voice devoid of any hesitation or fear. "I want the injunctions ready to file. I want the criminal referrals formatted for the federal prosecutor's office." "I am already pushing the preliminary documents through the secure federal court portal," Evelyn replied, her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard. "The digital paper trail is absolute. We possess the home router access logs matching the exact minute the forged deed transmitted to the bank. We possess the transaction hashes proving the money laundering. They have absolutely zero legal defense." She paused, looking directly into the camera lens. "When do we drop the hammer?" "Friday," I stated, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. "The morning of the wedding, I need to execute a separate transaction regarding the property deed tomorrow before we trigger the bank freeze. I will strip the ground out from under them first, and then we sever their liquidity." "Understood," Evelyn said, a predatory, satisfied smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I will have the federal agents on standby. Sleep well. Amy, we initiate the slaughter tomorrow." The video feed cut out, plunging the screen back into darkness. I sat back in the ergonomic mesh chair, rolling my shoulders. The trap possessed a flawless, airtight architecture. My parents and my future brother-in-law willingly walked into a federal snare, blinded entirely by their insatiable greed and their pathetic obsession with social supremacy. A sharp vibration rattled against the glass table. My smartphone screen illuminated, displaying an incoming text message. The sender identification read, "Warren." I picked up the device. Swiping past the lock screen, the text message manifested in the center of the display, dripping with the suffocating, unearned arrogance that defined his entire existence. The message read, "Your behavior in the foyer tonight was entirely unacceptable. You continue to project a pathetic, embarrassing energy. Do not attempt to contact your mother or me this week. Do not show up at the country club tomorrow. And absolutely do not attempt to access the reception venue on Saturday. We will reach out to you after Brianna and Trenton return from Europe. Use this time to fix your attitude and evaluate your failures." I stared at the glowing pixels. He did not offer a single word of gratitude for the decade of financial stability I provided. He did not express a microscopic ounce of remorse for expelling his oldest daughter from her own home. He issued commands, fully convinced he held the absolute authority to dictate my reality. He honestly believed he possessed the power to banish me. A glacial, terrifying calm washed over my nervous system, cooling my blood, the final, frayed thread of biological obligation permanently disintegrated, dissolving into dust. The psychological anchor cut completely, untethering me from the heavy, suffocating burden of seeking their elusive approval. The isolation they weaponized against me rapidly transformed into my absolute, untouchable advantage. I did not type a response. Engaging with a narcissist validates their delusion of control. I pressed the power button, locking the screen and plunging the device into blackness. I placed the phone face down on the table, silencing their existence. I turned my attention back to the illuminated monitors, pulling up the commercial real estate databases. The time for silent endurance officially concluded. The era of total, calculated obliteration had arrived. Dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline, casting sharp, angular shadows across the minimalist suite. I did not sleep. I consumed 2 cups of black coffee and finalized the digital framework for my primary offensive maneuver. I opened my encrypted contact ledger, scrolling past the standard underwriters and municipal clerks, stopping at a highly restricted cellular number. The number belonged to Victor, a notoriously aggressive corporate land developer. Victor operated a massive conglomerate infamous for acquiring distressed properties, raising the existing structures to the foundation, and erecting high-density luxury subdivisions. We crossed paths 3 years ago during a convoluted zoning audit. I untangled a fraudulent title claim that threatened to stall his flagship commercial project. He owed me a substantial favor. I dialed the number. Victor answered on the second ring, his voice a gravelly bark accustomed to shouting orders at construction foremen over the roar of heavy machinery. I bypassed the standard pleasantries. I informed him I held the unencumbered original deed to a sprawling colonial estate situated on 5 acres of prime suburban real estate. I explained the timeline I required an immediate, cash only, as is, transaction executed before the close of business today. Victor scoffed, citing the impossibility of a same-day closing. Until I stated the exact address, the line fell completely silent. He knew the acreage. His firm had coveted that specific zoning block for a decade. I offered him the property at a 20% market discount in exchange for instantaneous liquidity and 0 bureaucratic delays. He agreed to meet at his corporate headquarters in exactly 2 hours. I packed my briefcase. I secured the original, watermarked deed, my identification, and the digital forensic packet proving the $1.5 million lien was a criminal forgery. I descended to the street level, hailed a cab, and directed the driver toward the financial district. Victor's headquarters occupied the penthouse level of a towering monolith of black glass. I stepped out of the elevator into a reception area stripped of warmth, featuring raw concrete pillars and exposed steel beams. An assistant escorted me directly into a cavernous boardroom. The space felt less like an office and more like a predatory staging ground. An expansive, polished mahogany table anchored the room, surrounded by rigid, ergonomic leather chairs. Victor stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, surveying the urban grid below. He turned, offering a sharp, assessing nod. He did not waste time offering me a beverage. He gestured toward the table. I unlatched my briefcase, extracting the heavy, embossed folder. I slid the documents across the polished mahogany. Victor signaled his lead acquisitions attorney, a sharp-featured man who materialized from an adjacent side office. The attorney meticulously scrutinized the original deed. He ran his index finger along the raised seal, verifying its authenticity. He then opened the secondary folder containing the lien records. I watched his brow furrow as he processed the massive encumbrance attached to the title. I preempted his objection. The $1.5 million line of credit registered 48 hours ago is a federal forgery, I stated, my voice projecting crisp and authoritative across the quiet boardroom. I presented the router IP logs and the digital forensic analysis confirming Warren authorized the fraudulent signature. My corporate attorney, Evelyn, already filed the federal injunctions early this morning. The lien holds absolutely no legal weight. The title is clear, the equity is intact, and you are acquiring the acreage entirely unencumbered. Victor leaned over the table, his dark eyes scanning the irrefutable evidence of my parents' felony. A slow, ruthless smile stretched across his face. He recognized the sheer brutality of my maneuver. He realized I was not simply selling a house, I was orchestrating a devastating eviction. He stood to acquire highly coveted acreage at a massive discount by facilitating the execution. Draft the purchase agreement, Victor commanded his attorney, turning his back to the window. Cash sale, immediate possession, waive the standard inspection periods. The attorney typed frantically on a sleek laptop. A heavy commercial laser printer hummed to life in the corner, churning out stacks of dense legal contracts. The paperwork materialized before me. Evelyn, monitoring the transaction via a secure audio link in my wireless earpiece, reviewed the digital counterparts in real time. Her voice crackled softly in my ear, confirming the clauses contain no hidden liabilities and absolved me of any responsibility for the current occupants. I reached into my blazer and withdrew a solid silver fountain pen. The metal felt cold and heavy against my skin. I did not pause to mourn the childhood memories attached to the estate. I did not hesitate over the gravity of rendering my parents homeless on the eve of Brianna's wedding. I aligned the nib of the pen with the signature line. The steel scratched against the thick, premium paper. I pressed firmly, securing the ink into the fibers of the contract. I signed my name precisely, aggressively, overriding the forged digital replica Warren had submitted to the commercial bank, page by page. I transferred the ultimate authority of the property. I relinquished the manicured gardens, the sweeping mahogany staircase, the formal living room, and the towering crystal chandelier. I systematically dismantled the physical theater where they performed their fake aristocracy. I pushed the finalized stack of contracts back across the table. Victor snatched them up, verifying every signature. He nodded to his attorney. The attorney tapped a final sequence on his keyboard, initiating the wire transfer. I monitored the transaction on my encrypted tablet. I did not route the funds to any domestic banking institution. Warren possessed my social security number and my foundational identity documents. He could theoretically attempt to leverage or freeze standard domestic routing numbers during the impending fallout. I operated with zero margin for error. I provided Victor with the routing protocol for an offshore corporate trust I established years ago, entirely shielded from domestic civil litigation and unauthorized access. The loading bar on my screen pulsed. A sharp digital chime echoed from the tablet speakers. The massive seven-figure cash payment landed securely in the offshore vault. The capital was locked, untraceable, and permanently out of their reach. The legal title of the colonial estate officially changed hands. The municipal registry updated instantly, severing my name from the property record. At that exact second, Warren, Sylvia, and Brianna ceased to be the elite masters of a sprawling suburban manor. They instantly devolved into unauthorized trespassers, actively occupying a demolition site. I pictured them sitting in the kitchen I just sold, drinking espresso and discussing floral arrangements, completely blind to the fact that the floor beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. Victor collected the signed contracts, securing them within a leather portfolio. He turned back to his attorney. "Generate the notice to vacate," Victor ordered. "I want the demolition crews breaking ground next week. The current occupants need to be removed immediately." The printer whirred again. The attorney approached the table, carrying a single, heavy sheet of premium, watermarked legal paper. He handed it directly to me. I stared at the stark, uncompromising text. The header read, "Immediate notice of eviction and transfer of ownership" in bold, unyielding font. It cited the exact legal statutes requiring the occupants to vacate the premises, nullifying any implied tenancy. It explicitly stated that the new corporate ownership retained the right to forcibly strip the property and change the locks without further warning. I gripped the edges of the thick paper. The texture felt incredibly satisfying, a tangible manifestation of absolute justice. I slid the eviction notice into a protective sleeve and tucked it securely into my briefcase alongside my tablet. I stood up, smoothing the front of my wool slacks, and extended my hand across the mahogany table. Victor gripped my hand, offering a firm, respectful shake. We concluded the business without a single wasted word or emotional platitude. I walked out of the glass-walled boardroom, descending the elevator back to the chaotic Manhattan streets. The physical architecture of my parents' fake aristocracy was officially demolished. I possessed the cash, I held the eviction notice, and I controlled the timeline. The first pillar of their empire had just collapsed, and they possessed absolutely no idea the roof was already caving in. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket, pulling up the digital profiles of the commercial bank that held the fraudulent wedding loans. It was time to freeze the blood in their veins. I navigated the crowded Manhattan sidewalks, securing my leather briefcase firmly against my side. The chaos of the financial district blurred past me, a symphony of blaring horns and rushing pedestrians. I hailed a cab, instructing the driver to return to the towering glass business hotel. The physical architecture of my parents' fake aristocracy lay in ruins, but a structure cannot fully collapse while capital still flows through its veins. I needed to sever the financial artery fueling their delusion. I stepped out of the elevator on the 40th floor, swiped my magnetic key card, and pushed through the heavy door of my executive suite. The room remained perfectly sterile, bathed in the sharp afternoon light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I discarded my wool blazer over the back of the leather armchair and immediately took my seat at the glass dining table. I tapped the spacebar, waking my dual monitors. The encrypted forensic terminal flared to life. I did not reach for my phone to dial the bank's toll-free customer service number. Low-level tellers and call center representatives lacked the security clearance to halt seven-figure transactions. Submitting a standard fraud claim generates a digital ticket, launching a tedious bureaucratic investigation that crawls through middle management for weeks. I required instantaneous, catastrophic intervention. I needed to bypass the gatekeepers and strike directly at the apex of the institution's risk management infrastructure. I opened my offline hard drive. Retrieving the master dossier I compiled the previous night, I extracted the precise metadata, proving the digital signatures on the $1.5 million line of credit were counterfeit. I isolated the Internet protocol logs captured from the estate's broadband router, formatting the data to highlight the exact geographic coordinates and device identification numbers used to authorize the loan. I attached the municipal records exposing the corrupt notary public, explicitly linking the license to the defunct warehouse owned by Trenton's family. I merged the raw data files into a single, cohesive risk assessment packet. I drafted a stark, uncompromising executive summary. I did not use passive language. I explicitly cited the federal statutes for aggravated identity theft, interstate wire fraud, and violations of federal anti-money laundering protocols. I branded the transaction as an active, hostile cybercrime exploiting the bank's commercial lending division. Utilizing my firm's secure executive directory, I bypassed the public-facing contact portals. I queried the banking registry, locating the unlisted, direct email address for the institution's Senior Vice President of Executive Risk Management. I attached the encrypted fraud packet. I hit send. The progress bar flashed across my primary screen, transmitting the digital execution order through a secure, encrypted tunnel. I verified the delivery receipt. The packet landed directly in the executive inbox. I engaged my tracking software, syncing my terminal to the external clearinghouse nodes that monitor interbank liquidity. A financial institution operating at that echelon utilizes aggressive, automated threat detection protocols. When a verified corporate underwriter submits hard evidence of seven-figure federal fraud, the bank does not convene a committee. They initiate emergency containment. I monitored the digital ledger, my eyes tracking the data streams. The response materialized with breathtaking velocity, exactly 14 minutes after transmission. A harsh, red alert flag populated next to the $1.5 million account on my tracking monitor. The bank executed a structural freeze. The account status abruptly shifted from active to permanently locked. The remaining capital, the $500,000 Warren intended to utilize to pay the five-star caterers, the imported floral designers, and the luxury hotel block slammed against an impenetrable digital wall. The funds instantly vaporized into administrative lockup. The bank severed Warren's access entirely, his premium debit cards deactivated, his checking privileges terminated. His wire transfer capabilities died at that exact second. The automated freeze did not stop with my father. Financial institutions operate with ruthless, calculating self-preservation. When their risk algorithms detect active money laundering, they follow the stolen capital downstream to quarantine the contagion. The bank's internal security software traced the initial wire transfers. The algorithm isolated the $1 million Warren previously routed into the blind corporate shell entity, registered in Delaware. The system cross-referenced the employer identification numbers, piercing the corporate veil with automated precision. The code connected the Delaware shell entity directly to Trenton's primary commercial holding accounts. The contagion spread across my monitor. A cascading series of red error notifications erupted across the tracking software. The bank did not merely freeze the stolen $1 million, because Trenton linked a fraudulent laundering vehicle to his primary business profiles. He triggered a catastrophic breach of his loan covenants. The bank initiated a blanket lockdown across Trenton's entire commercial portfolio. The capital he utilized to stall the foreclosures on his toxic debt locked instantly. The operating accounts for his regional development firm shut down. His personal executive lines of credit terminated. The bank froze every single financial asset bearing his signature, freezing his liquidity pending a full federal investigation. I sat back in my ergonomic mesh chair, watching the routing nodes turn a dead, solid red across both screens. The digital map of their wealth transformed into a graveyard. The vendor accounts tied to Brianna's wedding preparations flashed with pending transaction failures. The deposits scheduled for the string quartet blocked. The payments for the imported champagne bounced. I picked up my ceramic mug, taking a slow sip of cold black coffee. I stared at the glowing red nodes, letting the absolute finality of the execution wash over me. The mathematical precision of their ruin felt deeply satisfying. I checked the digital clock resting in the corner of my monitor. The afternoon steadily progressed. I pictured my family navigating their day, utterly blind to the invisible guillotine that just severed their heads. I envisioned Brianna sitting in an exclusive salon chair, barking orders at stylists, boasting about her impending high society wedding while holding a deactivated credit card. I imagined Trenton strutting across a stalled construction site, wearing his custom charcoal suit, barking aggressive commands at contractors, fully convinced his brilliant financial maneuvering had saved his collapsing empire. I pictured Warren and Sylvia holding court at a corner table in their elite country club. signing heavy lunch tabs to an account that the federal government currently classified as a crime scene. They operated as walking ghosts. They paraded around the city, curating their fake aristocracy, aggressively demanding respect from everyone they encountered. They believed they had successfully excised the only remaining obstacle in their path by expelling me from the estate. They possessed absolutely no idea that their entire aristocratic facade was now completely bankrupt. They were operating on a severed financial artery, bleeding out internally while maintaining a pristine exterior. The money intended to fund their arrogant delusion was locked inside a digital vault they could never breach. I closed the tracking software and locked my terminal. I secured the eviction notice inside my briefcase. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the crawling traffic of the Manhattan grid. The legal title to the colonial estate belonged to Victor's demolition firm. The stolen $1.5 million belonged to the federal fraud investigators. Warren, Sylvia, Brianna, and Trenton possessed absolutely nothing. The preparation phase officially concluded. The groundwork lay perfectly in place. Now, I required the physical stage to reveal their destruction. It was time to coordinate with the midnight moving crew. It was time to strip the remaining illusions from their lives, leaving them standing in an empty, echoing shell. Dusk settled over the sprawling suburban neighborhood, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns. Friday evening arrived, bringing with it the crisp chill of the impending weekend. 10 miles away, nestled within the gated perimeter of a 5-star country club, Warren, Sylvia, Brianna, and Trenton occupied the epicenter of an extravagant rehearsal dinner. They clinked crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. They delivered boastful, arrogant toasts to a room packed with local politicians and elite commercial developers. They smiled for the hired photographers, projecting the flawless illusion of untouchable, generational wealth. They basked in the warmth of their fabricated aristocracy, completely oblivious to the fact that their sanctuary was currently targeted for total physical annihilation. The colonial estate sat dark and entirely vacant. I stood at the end of the long gravel driveway, the collar of my wool coat pulled tight against the evening wind. I checked the illuminated dial of my wristwatch. Right on schedule, the heavy guttural rumble of diesel engines fractured the quiet suburban street. A convoy of 4 massive, unmarked box trucks turned onto the property, their headlights sweeping across the brick facade of the house. The trucks maneuvered into the driveway, aligning their rear loading ramps with the front entrance. These men did not work for a standard moving company. I coordinated directly with Victor, the corporate land developer who now possessed the legal deed to the estate. Victor dispatched his specialized demolition preparation crew, a team of hardened, efficient contractors tasked with rapidly stripping acquired structures to the studs before the heavy excavators arrived. The lead foreman stepped down from the cab of the primary truck. He carried a heavy steel clipboard and moved with the brisk, no-nonsense efficiency of a military commander. I met him on the brick walkway, producing my corporate identification and the finalized transfer contracts authorized by his employer. He verified the documents, offered a single, sharp nod, and signaled his men. The crew swarmed the property. They operated without shouting, without idle chatter, communicating through hand signals and practiced routine. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors for the absolute final time, pushing them wide open. The contractors flooded the grand foyer. "Change the exterior cylinders first," the foreman commanded, pointing a gloved finger at a man carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. The locksmith dropped to his knees before the front doors. He drove a high-powered titanium drill bit straight through the antique brass keyholes. The metal shrieked, spitting gold shavings across the mosaic tiles. Within 4 minutes, he extracted the compromised mechanisms, installing heavy-duty, industrial deadbolts in their place. He handed me the sole, newly cut steel key. The physical barrier was established. My family officially possessed zero access to the interior. The extraction phase commenced. I stood in the corner of the formal living room, my arms crossed over my chest, watching the men dismantle the physical theater of my parents' delusion. 2 broad-shouldered workers grabbed either end of the velvet sofa, the exact sofa where Brianna lounged, while demanding I fetch her coffee, and hoisted it into the air. They hauled it out the front door, tossing it unceremoniously into the cavernous belly of the first box truck. The mahogany accent tables followed. The imported Persian rugs were rolled into tight, heavy cylinders, bound with thick nylon straps and carried out into the night. A specialized team rolled a towering aluminum scaffold into the center of the room, positioning it directly beneath the massive crystal chandelier. The electrician scaled the metal rungs, severed the primary wiring, and unscrewed the heavy iron mounting brackets. The men on the floor manipulated a pulley system, lowering the glittering fixture. The hundreds of cut glass prisms chimed softly as they settled into a padded wooden crate. They nailed the crate shut, sealing away the light source that illuminated Brianna's arrogant social media broadcasts. The living room transformed instantly, stripped of the antique furniture and the suffocating opulence. The true dimensions of the space revealed themselves. The room felt cavernous, cold, and entirely sterile. The crew advanced to the formal dining room. They dismantled the long mahogany table, the precise location where Sylvia slammed her leather wedding ledger, and demanded I drain my savings to fund their extravagant demands. The workers snapped the table legs off the base, wrapping the polished wood in heavy moving blankets, and marched it out the door. They cleared the display cabinets, packing the fine china and the heavy crystal Scotch goblets Warren utilized to project his patriarchal authority. I directed the foreman toward the second floor. Clear the bedrooms, leave absolutely nothing behind. The boots of the demolition crew pounded against the wooden treads of the sweeping staircase. I followed them upward, stepping into Brianna's bedroom. The room looked like the staging area for a royal coronation. Dozens of designer shoeboxes lined the walls, expensive. Imported cosmetics cluttered the vanity. A rolling garment rack occupied the center of the room, holding her rehearsal dresses, her silk robes, and the tailored suits she hoarded for her European honeymoon. The contractors did not treat the items with reverence. They treated the designer garments like debris obstructing a demolition site. They unhooked the garment rack and rolled the entire assembly down the hallway, the silk fabrics dragging against the floorboards. They swept the expensive cosmetics into heavy black trash bags, knotting the plastic tightly. They dismantled the vanity, the velvet headboard, and the towering mirrors. They eradicated the entire physical backdrop of her fake aristocratic persona in less than 20 minutes. The crew marched into the master suite, stripping Warren's bespoke suits from the closets and dismantling Sylvia's antique vanity. They operated with ruthless, mechanical precision, moving from room to room, erasing every single trace of the family that occupied the space just hours prior. The hours bled away. The noise of the operation shifted. As the furniture vanished, the acoustics of the estate altered dramatically. The heavy, muffled silence of a furnished manor yielded to a sharp, echoing void. Every footstep rang out like a gunshot against the bare hardwood floors. Every cough or dropped tool vibrated against the exposed drywall. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the operation concluded. The foreman approached me in the empty grand foyer. He handed me his clipboard. I signed the manifest, authorizing the completion of the extraction. "The trucks are loaded," the foreman stated, his voice echoing loudly in the hollow space. "We are transporting the contents to the designated storage facility. The demolition-heavy machinery arrives on Monday." "Understood," I replied, my voice bouncing off the bare walls. "Thank you." The crew filed out the front doors, marching back to the idling trucks. The heavy metal ramps slammed shut, echoing like thunder in the quiet suburban night. The diesel engines roared, and the convoy rolled away, their taillights fading into the darkness. I stood completely alone inside the cavernous, echoing shell of the colonial estate. The moonlight poured through the uncovered floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, pale rectangles across the bare, scuffed hardwood floors. I walked into the center of the massive, vacant living room. The silence felt heavy, absolute and deeply profound. The suffocating weight of my family's entitlement was completely gone, hauled away in the back of 4 unmarked trucks. I walked out to the trunk of my sedan, parked in the gravel driveway. I opened the trunk lid and retrieved 2 specific items. I pulled out a single, heavy steel folding chair and a thick, black leather folder. I carried the items back through the front doors, locking the new industrial deadbolt behind me. I marched to the exact center of the empty living room. I gripped the frame of the steel folding chair and pulled. The metal snapped open with a harsh, sharp clank that reverberated off the bare walls, ringing in the empty air. I placed the chair squarely on the floorboards, ensuring all 4 rubber feet rested perfectly level. I took the thick, black leather folder and placed it squarely on the cold steel seat. The folder contained the absolute annihilation of their reality. I packed the legal deed of sale, proving Victor's corporate conglomerate now possessed total ownership of the estate and authorizing the impending demolition. I included the premium, watermarked eviction notice, explicitly revoking their right to occupy the premises. Beneath the real estate documents, I layered the financial execution orders. I printed the automated alerts from the commercial bank, featuring the glaring red transaction failures. The documents explicitly detailed the absolute structural freeze placed upon the $1.5 million line of credit. I included the secondary notices proving Trenton's commercial portfolio was locked, pending a federal investigation. At the very bottom of the stack, I placed the digital execution roadmap. I included the precise internet protocol logs extracted from the utility closet router. I included the metadata tracking Warren's exact keystrokes during the forgery. I included the transaction hashes mapping Trenton's illegal offshore wire transfers. The physical trap was set flawlessly. I stood back, observing the stark, brutal minimalism of the scene. A massive, echoing, empty room, a cheap steel folding chair, a black leather folder. Tomorrow morning, Warren, Sylvia, Brianna, and Trenton would arrive at this address, wearing their designer clothing, expecting to utilize the grand staircase and the crystal chandeliers for their heavily televised pre-wedding photo shoot. They would push through the side doors, expecting to find their sanctuary of wealth and privilege waiting to validate their egos. Instead, they would step into a desolate void. They would find the bare bones of their destroyed illusion. And they would find the irrefutable, undeniable proof that the daughter they told to disappear had successfully engineered their complete eradication. I turned my back on the steel chair. I walked through the empty foyer, pushing the front door open, and stepping out into the freezing night air. I pulled the heavy oak door shut, listening to the heavy industrial deadbolt click firmly into place. The lock engaged, sealing the trap. The stage was fully prepared for the morning slaughter. I drove back to the city, leaving the desolate, locked shell of the estate behind in the rearview mirror. I parked my sedan in the subterranean garage of the business hotel and rode the elevator back to my 40th floor executive suite. I did not rest. I poured a glass of ice water, pulled the ergonomic mesh chair up to the glass dining table, and awakened my encrypted terminal. The physical extraction concluded perfectly. The digital fallout now demanded my absolute, undivided attention. 10 miles away, nestled behind the wrought iron gates of an exclusive country club, the rehearsal dinner operated at maximum velocity. The venue possessed towering, vaulted ceilings, walls paneled in rich, dark oak, and a staff trained to cater to the whims of the ultra-wealthy. Warren, Sylvia, Brianna, and Trenton occupied the epicenter of the grand ballroom. I leaned forward, resting my forearms against the cool glass table, tracking the active financial nodes tied to their identities. I watched the data pulse across my dual monitors, visualizing the exact sequence of events unfolding in that opulent room. Brianna undoubtedly held court near the center of the ballroom. Draped in a custom silk rehearsal gown, she spun her 2-carat diamond under the ambient light, absorbing the envious stares of her bridesmaids. Sylvia circulated among the elite guests, her wrist heavy with pearls, laughing too loudly at jokes delivered by state senators and prominent local developers. Warren gripped a crystal tumbler of vintage scotch, projecting the illusion of a towering patriarchal titan, boasting about his fabricated commercial investments. They basked in their untouchable arrogance. They functioned on the pure, intoxicating adrenaline of social supremacy. A sharp, piercing chime erupted from my laptop speakers, slicing through the quiet hum of the hotel suite. The tracking software I synced to the commercial bank's risk management portal registered an active, live ping. I locked my eyes onto the primary monitor. A transaction request materialized in the system log. The digital ledger identified the point of sale, the primary mahogany bar at the country club. The transaction amount registered at $4,500. Brianna attempted to authorize a massive, open tab to supply rounds of imported, vintage champagne for her bridal party. The data stream paused for a microscopic fraction of a second as the country club's payment terminal communicated with the banking server. The commercial bank processed the routing number, hit the structural freeze I initiated hours ago, and responded with lethal automated efficiency. A bright, glaring red banner slashed across my screen. Transaction denied. Code administrative lock. I envisioned the exact moment the humiliation struck. Brianna stood at the polished mahogany counter, expecting the bartender to hand over the heavy, dripping bottles of champagne. Instead, the bartender frowned, staring at the flashing red light on the point-of-sale terminal. He retrieved her black metal credit card, holding it delicately between his fingers, and lowered his voice, offering a polite, discreet apology. Brianna's triumphant smile shattered, her perfectly contoured face flushed with a sudden, violent surge of indignant heat. She snatched the heavy metal card from the bartender's hand, her manicured nails scraping against the wood. She scoffed, loudly blaming the country club's outdated machinery, desperate to preserve her pristine image in front of her bridesmaids. She turned and snapped her fingers, summoning Trenton. The tracking software pulsed again. A second transaction request populated the digital ledger. Trenton intervened to save his fiancée from the embarrassment. He slid his premium, heavy corporate card across the bar, attempting to authorize the $4,500 charge. He offered the bartender a patronizing, arrogant smirk, projecting the aura of a man who possessed unlimited liquidity. The commercial bank servers processed his corporate routing number. The algorithm hit the catastrophic breach of his loan covenants, identified the active federal money laundering flags, and executed the exact same protocol. The red banner flashed across my monitor a second time. Transaction denied. Code Federal Review hold. I sat back in my chair, taking a slow sip of ice water. The absolute, unmitigated panic striking Trenton's chest must have felt like a physical blow. He stared at the declined terminal. The patronizing smirk melted entirely off his face, replaced by a pale, sickly pallor. A declined corporate card at a high society event represented the ultimate mark of shame. The bartender slid the card back across the mahogany surface, his deferential posture stiffening into mild suspicion. Trenton grabbed the plastic, his fingers trembling slightly. He offered Brianna a clipped, breathless excuse, turned on his heel, and marched out of the grand ballroom. I monitored his movements through the data. 3 minutes later, a ping registered on the bank's automated customer service log. Trenton retreated to the quiet, marble-lined hallway of the country club, far away from the string quartet and the clinking crystal glasses. He paced the long corridor, pulling at the knot of his silk tie, his breathing turning rapid and shallow as he dialed the elite client service line. He bypassed the standard prompts, punching in his corporate executive identification number. He expected to reach a fawning account manager who would instantly apologize and clear the fraud hold. Instead, the automated system routed him directly into the compliance division. I watched the audio log register the interaction. Trenton pressed his smartphone against his ear, his knuckles turning stark white. A cold, synthetic, automated voice delivered the execution order. Your commercial portfolios and affiliated personal accounts are currently locked pending a federal risk management review. We cannot authorize the release of any capital. Please contact the Federal Fraud Division during standard legal operating hours. Goodbye. The call terminated. The reality of his destruction slammed into him. The oxygen drained from the marble hallway. Trenton staggered backward, his shoulders hitting the wood-paneled wall. A cold, heavy sweat broke across his forehead, slicking his hair against his skin. The money he stole to stall his commercial foreclosures, locked. His operating accounts froze, the financial artery keeping his toxic empire afloat severed completely. He stared at his phone, his mind frantically attempting to calculate the blast radius of a federal banking freeze. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hallway swung open. Warren stepped out of the ballroom, carrying his crystal tumbler of scotch. Warren found his future son-in-law leaning against the wall, hyperventilating, his tailored suit jacket wrinkled, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Warren approached, his brow furrowing in deep irritation. He despised weakness. He despised anything that threatened to interrupt his projection of absolute power. Trenton choked out the reality. He explained the declined cards. He explained the automated Federal Review message. He stammered, his voice cracking, as he outlined the total structural freeze placed upon his commercial shell companies and the $1.5 million line of credit. Warren did not panic. His sheer bottomless arrogance blinded him to the impending catastrophe. Warren took a slow sip of his scotch, rolling his eyes in profound, elitist annoyance. He clapped a heavy hand onto Trenton's trembling shoulder. He scoffed, dismissing the federal alert as a simple, bureaucratic algorithm trigger. He claimed the bank's security software automatically flagged the massive, out-of-state vendor payments they processed earlier in the week. He insisted that moving large amounts of liquidity over a weekend always tripped standard security protocols. "Pull yourself together," Warren commanded, his deep voice echoing sharply in the quiet corridor. "You look like a terrified amateur. It is a temporary glitch. My attorneys will call the bank president on Monday morning and threaten to pull our entire portfolio. Act like a man who possesses leverage. Adjust your tie, walk back into that ballroom, and project strength." Trenton swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He wanted to believe the lie. He desperately needed to believe the delusion Warren aggressively peddled. Trenton wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He adjusted the knot of his tie, forcing his trembling fingers to steady. He straightened his spine, pulling the tailored jacket tight across his shoulders. They pushed through the heavy oak doors and returned to the rehearsal dinner. I sat in my quiet, sterile hotel suite, watching the zero balance markers finalize on my tracking software. The digital graveyard solidified. Inside the country club, the facade resumed. Brianna laughed loudly at a table filled with politicians. Completely unaware she possessed zero capital to pay the final balances for her floral arrangements. Sylvia ordered a secondary round of expensive caviar, blind to the fact that her credit lines were entirely dead. Warren commanded the room, delivering a boastful toast regarding generational legacy, projecting absolute dominance. Trenton stood near the edge of the ballroom, nursing a glass of bourbon he could not afford. The cold sweat returned, prickling at the base of his neck. He forced a rigid, hollow smile, shaking hands with elite developers, while his heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He felt the foundation crumbling beneath his expensive leather shoes. They spent the entire evening sweating under their tailored suits, desperately trying to project immeasurable wealth, while their financial empire actively burned to the ground around them. I locked my terminal, snapping the laptop shut. I stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glowing grid of the city. The digital execution functioned flawlessly. The physical extraction stripped their sanctuary bare. They survived Friday night sustained entirely by their own arrogance. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise, the wedding day would commence, and the final, inescapable reality would crash down upon their heads. The Saturday morning sun crested the Manhattan skyline, piercing the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive suite. I sat perfectly still before my glass dining table, wrapping my hands around a fresh mug of black coffee. I bypassed my corporate auditing software and launched a secure, encrypted web portal. Victor, anticipating the impending demolition of his newly acquired acreage, dispatched a private security contractor to the colonial estate immediately following the midnight extraction. The contractor installed a network of high-definition, motion-activated surveillance cameras throughout the interior and exterior of the property. Victor granted me temporary administrative access to the live feed. A grid of 9 separate camera angles populated my primary monitor. The screen displayed the brick facade, the sprawling gravel driveway, the grand foyer, the sweeping staircase, and the primary living spaces. The house sat in crisp, high-resolution silence. At exactly 7 o'clock, a heavy black luxury SUV turned onto the property. The vehicle idled near the front steps, the tires crushing the manicured gravel. Warren pushed the driver's side door open and stepped out into the biting morning air. He did not look like a commanding commercial real estate titan preparing to host the social event of the decade. He looked haggard. He wore the same wrinkled, white dress shirt and dark trousers he sported at the rehearsal dinner. The family booked suites at the country club for the night, avoiding the logistical chaos of the estate, intending to return this morning solely to dress, apply cosmetics, and utilize the grand staircase for their globally televised pre-wedding photo shoot. Sylvia emerged from the passenger side, pulling a cashmere wrap tightly around her shoulders to ward off the chill. She wore her cocktail dress from the previous evening, the fabric creased and stained. Brianna slid out of the back seat, clutching a large, insulated coffee cup. She wore a silk tracksuit, her hair pulled into a messy knot. She marched up the brick walkway, her face locked in a severe, demanding scowl. She tapped her smartphone screen aggressively, undoubtedly tracking the GPS coordinates of her hired hair and makeup syndicate. She expected to walk through the heavy oak doors and find her custom European wedding gown waiting on a velvet mannequin. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching the physical execution commence. Warren climbed the front steps, projecting his usual aura of unearned entitlement. He pulled his gold keyring from his pocket, isolating the heavy brass key for the front door. He thrust the metal into the cylinder. The lock rejected the key entirely. Warren paused, his brow furrowed in deep irritation. He retracted the key, inspected the grooves, and shoved it back into the mechanism. He twisted his wrist, applying aggressive torque. The industrial deadbolt the locksmith installed just hours ago refused to yield. The heavy steel pins held the door firmly in place. Warren cursed, a sharp expletive captured by the exterior microphone. He slammed the heel of his palm against the thick oak wood. He despised physical resistance. He operated under the assumption that every door in his life should swing wide open the second he arrived. Sylvia crossed her arms, her mouth moving in a rapid, agitated cadence. She complained about the cold, demanding Warren cease his fumbling. Brianna let out a loud, theatrical sigh, pointing toward the driveway, anxious for the arrival of her media team. Warren's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. A vein pulsed against his temple, stripped of his patience. He abandoned the front porch and stomped across the dew-soaked lawn, rounding the corner of the brick facade toward the side conservatory entrance. I switched the primary feed to the side patio camera. Warren marched up to the glass-paned conservatory door. He gripped the brass handle and yanked. The interior lock held firm, the patriarchal facade fractured, giving way to primal, brute frustration. Warren bent down, hoisted a heavy, jagged landscaping stone from the adjacent garden bed, and swung it forward. The rock shattered the glass pane. Sharp, crystalline shards exploded inward, raining across the patio tiles with a chaotic, crashing symphony. Warren reached his arm through the jagged opening, uncaring as a rogue shard sliced the fabric of his sleeve. He threw the interior deadbolt, pushed the heavy door open, and breached the threshold of the property he no longer owned. Sylvia and Brianna followed closely behind him, stepping carefully over the broken glass. I shifted my focus to the interior foyer camera. Warren took 3 aggressive, stomping strides onto the mosaic tile and abruptly froze. The kinetic energy drained from his body in a single, paralyzing heartbeat. His polished leather shoes squeaked against the floorboards as he halted. Sylvia bumped directly into his back. She peered around his broad shoulder, her jaw going entirely slack. Brianna stepped up beside them, the insulated coffee cup freezing halfway to her mouth. They stared into the absolute void. The grand illusion shattered instantly. The antique mahogany console tables were gone. The imported Persian rugs no longer covered the hardwood. The towering crystal chandelier no longer dominated the vaulted ceiling. Only a severed cluster of industrial wires dangled from the plaster. The sprawling velvet sofas, the curated oil paintings, the heavy silk draperies, everything vanished. The sanctuary they utilized to project their superiority stripped down to the bare studs and scuffed floorboards. The audio feed captured a profound, suffocating silence. The ambient hum of the central heating echoed through the cavernous space, amplifying the sheer emptiness of the structure. Brianna's fingers spasmed. The insulated coffee cup slipped from her grip, hitting the bare hardwood with a sharp crack. Brown liquid exploded across the floor, pooling against the baseboards. She did not gasp. She broke into a dead, frantic sprint. She abandoned her parents in the foyer, her expensive sneakers slipping slightly on the spilled coffee. She scrambled up the sweeping, bare wooden staircase. The microphones picked up the heavy, chaotic pounding of her footsteps, the sound bouncing off the walls like hammer strikes in an empty warehouse. I tracked her movement, bringing the second-floor landing camera to the primary screen. Brianna reached the top of the stairs, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a manic, feral terror. She bolted down the hallway and threw open the door to her bedroom. The camera mounted in the corner of her room captured the exact moment her reality collapsed. She expected to find her rolling garment racks holding thousands of dollars in imported silk. She expected to see her vanity overflowing with luxury cosmetics. She expected the physical proof of her aristocratic status, waiting to validate her ego on the most important day of her life. She found exposed drywall, dust motes dancing in the morning light, and bare wooden planks. Her knees buckled. Brianna crumpled onto the hard floor, the impact jarring her spine. She threw her head back, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. A visceral, piercing shriek ripped from her throat. The scream tore through the empty house, a raw, terrifying manifestation of a shattered ego. She dug her manicured nails into the gaps of the floorboards, tearing at her own hair, wailing into the empty space, her custom gown, her European shoes, her entire curated social media identity eradicated. Downstairs, the piercing shriek reverberated through the barren living room, rattling Sylvia to her core. Sylvia gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of oxygen. Her hands flew to her face, her fingers pressing desperately against her cheeks. She gripped Warren's forearm, her nails digging deep into the wrinkled fabric of his dress shirt. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow jerks. Sylvia hyperventilated, her sophisticated country club composure disintegrating entirely. She looked around the desolate room, her eyes darting frantically from the empty corners to the bare walls, desperately searching for a rational explanation that did not exist. Warren did not comfort her. He did not wrap his arm around his wife to stabilize her panic. Warren stood entirely paralyzed. He rotated slowly on his heels, scanning the desolate dining room, the barren kitchen, and the echoing hallway. The physical fortress he leveraged to command respect from the local politicians and elite developers vanished overnight. The stage where he performed his patriarchal theater was repossessed. They wandered forward, detaching from one another. They moved through the desolate rooms like shell-shocked survivors navigating the epicenter of a localized blast. Their footsteps rang out with a hollow, mocking resonance. I watched them stand in the center of the massive, empty living room. The morning sunlight poured through the uncovered windows, highlighting the exhaustion on their faces and the stale, wrinkled clothing they wore from the previous night. The contrast between their expectations and their current reality proved staggering. They planned to spend the morning sipping mimosas, surrounded by media teams and fawning attendants, wrapping themselves in bespoke tailoring and imported diamonds. Instead, they looked like vagrants trespassing inside a condemned building. They possessed no designer garments to change into. They possessed no antique backdrop for their photographers. They possessed absolutely nothing. The reality of their total vulnerability crushed their arrogant posture. Warren's broad shoulders slumped forward, the weight of his invisible empire finally snapping his spine. The commanding titan devolved into a desperate, confused old man standing on a bare floor. I took a slow sip of my coffee, resting my hand on the cool glass table. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the deep, settling peace of an architect watching a perfectly engineered demolition. They stripped me of my dignity, my savings, and my identity, fully expecting me to disappear into the shadows. Now. They occupied the exact void they attempted to force me into. The physical illusion evaporated, leaving them completely exposed. The camera panned slightly, catching the glint of metal in the center of the living room floor. Warren finally stopped rotating. His bloodshot eyes locked onto the solitary object occupying his destroyed sanctuary. He took a hesitant, staggering step forward. The execution shifted from the physical realm directly into the legal. It was time for my father to read his own death warrant. Warren staggered forward, his polished leather shoes scraping against the bare hardwood. He crossed the vast, echoing expanse of the living room, moving like a man navigating the epicenter of a blast radius. He approached the solitary steel folding chair. The cheap industrial metal looked entirely alien against the backdrop of the vaulted ceiling and custom crown molding. He halted directly in front of the chair. He stared down at the thick, black leather folder resting on the seat. Warren reached out, his fingers trembling violently. He snatched the binder, his knuckles turning stark white as he ripped open the heavy cover. I leaned closer to my monitor, watching the high-definition feed capture the exact moment his world collapsed. The first document rested on top of the stack. The thick, watermarked legal paper featured a bold, uncompromising header, transfer of deed and immediate notice of eviction. Warren's bloodshot eyes darted across the page, tracking the dense legal text. He read the name of the purchasing entity. The corporate developer's moniker struck him like a physical blow to the sternum. Warren operated in commercial real estate. He recognized Victor's conglomerate. He knew Victor acquired distressed acreage, razed the existing structures to the foundation, and paved over the rubble. Warren traced the transaction details. The document explicitly confirmed a cash-only sale, finalized the previous afternoon, transferring the property entirely unencumbered. His gaze dropped to the bottom of the page. He found the authorization signature. It was not the digital forgery he meticulously manufactured in his home office. It was my physical, aggressive cursive, driven deep into the paper with a silver fountain pen. He realized he did not occupy his prestigious manor. He trespassed inside a condemned demolition site. The first page slipped from his trembling grip, fluttering through the air and landing face down on the scuffed floorboards. Warren turned his attention to the second document. The execution shifted from the real estate portfolio directly into the financial sector. The commercial bank letterhead glared back at him, bearing the official seal of the Executive Risk Management Division. He read the status update for the $1.5 million line of credit. A stark red stamp dominated the center of the page. Account frozen. Administrative lock. Pending federal investigation. Warren's breathing fragmented into rapid, shallow wheezes. The oxygen drained entirely from his lungs. He flipped the page, desperate to find a notice of a temporary bureaucratic error. He expected a standard banking glitch. He found a forensic data packet. Warren stared at the raw digital logs printed on the crisp white paper. He recognized the internet protocol address. He recognized the exact alphanumeric string belonging to the broadband router he installed in the utility closet. He tracked the timestamps. The digital footprint isolated his personal laptop, logging the precise minute he transmitted the forged signature to the commercial underwriter. He turned another page, his hands shaking so severely the paper rattled. The next document highlighted Trenton's corrupt notary public. The data mapped the state license directly to the abandoned commercial warehouse owned by Trenton's family. It detailed the interconnected web of fraud, establishing a clear, undeniable chain of evidence. The suffocating truth finally pierced through his impenetrable arrogance. The daughter he ordered to pack her bags and disappear did not retreat in shame. She did not cower in a cheap motel, weeping over her lost family. She sat at the dining room table, drinking coffee, while actively dismantling his criminal enterprise. She captured his digital fingerprints, audited his illegal wire transfers, packaged his felony, and left the federal execution order resting on a folding chair. "Warren!" Sylvia gasped, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. She pushed away from the doorway, taking a hesitant step into the living room. "Warren? What is it? Where is our furniture?" Warren could not speak. His jaw locked. A bead of cold sweat broke from his hairline, tracing a slow, agonizing path down the side of his pale cheek. He stared at the forensic packet, the weight of a multi-decade federal prison sentence crushing his spine. Heavy, frantic footsteps thundered down the bare wooden staircase. Brianna burst into the living room, moving with jerky, uncoordinated desperation. Her silk tracksuit carried a thick layer of gray dust from her collapse on the upstairs floorboards. Her carefully maintained hair hung in chaotic, tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were wide, feral, and darting wildly across the barren space. She spotted Warren standing in the center of the room, clutching the black leather binder. Brianna lunged forward. She shoved Sylvia aside, closed the distance, and ripped the folder directly from Warren's paralyzed grip. She did not care about the property deed. She did not understand the internet protocol logs or the notary licenses. She flipped frantically through the stack of documents, searching for vendor contracts, catering itineraries, or any remaining shred of her fabricated aristocracy. She hit the bank ledgers. Brianna stared at the printouts detailing the specific escrow accounts established to fund her European gowns, her 5-star catering staff, and her imported floral installations. She scanned the balance line. The number read 0. Her eyes dropped to the transaction history. The column dedicated to pending authorizations displayed a solid, impenetrable wall of red rejection notices. The payments to the country club bounced. The wire transfers to the jewelers failed. The deposits for the string quartet terminated. The numbers confirmed she possessed absolutely nothing. Brianna dropped the folder. The heavy leather slapped against the hardwood, scattering the banking documents across the floor. She threw her head back, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. A guttural, primal wail ripped from her throat, tearing through the empty house. The sound held no theatrical manipulation. It was a raw, visceral manifestation of total ego death. She clutched the sides of her head, digging her fingernails into her scalp, and sank to her knees. She collapsed onto the scattered evidence of her ruined life, weeping violently. The fake, aristocratic persona she spent years cultivating on social media incinerated in a matter of seconds. She possessed no wedding. She possessed no elite status. She possessed no wealthy future. She was a trespasser crying on a dirty floor. Sylvia backed away, her hands covering her mouth. Her knees buckled. She slid down the bare drywall, hitting the floorboards with a dull thud. She curled her arms around her stomach, hyperventilating, her sophisticated country club composure permanently eradicated. The atmosphere inside the living room shifted entirely. The endless gaslighting, the patronizing insults, the constant mockery of my spinster aesthetic, it all evaporated into the cold morning air. The suffocating terror of federal consequences replaced their arrogant bravado. They no longer operated as superior, untouchable elites looking down upon a disposable corporate drone. They devolved into terrified, cornered criminals awaiting the inevitable arrival of law enforcement. I sat in my high-rise hotel suite, staring at the grid of surveillance monitors. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter, complex flavor. The physical trap worked flawlessly. The psychological devastation registered absolute and complete. They absorbed the reality of their destruction, turning on each other in the silent, echoing void of the house they stole. But the execution remained incomplete. Warren and Brianna understood they lacked a house and a wedding, but they still required Trenton to complete the circle of ruin. The architect of the money laundering scheme remained absent from the stage. I checked my watch, watching the second hand sweep across the dial. Trenton would arrive shortly, expecting to find a fawning family and a beautiful bride ready for the cameras. He would walk through those shattered doors, and the final, lethal phase of the operation would commence. I set my coffee mug onto the glass table, leaning closer to the screens, waiting for the federal ambush to begin. A stretched black limousine crunched aggressively onto the gravel driveway, the heavy vehicle braking with a sharp jolt. The limousine idled near the front steps, but Trenton did not wait for his hired chauffeur to circle around and open the rear door. He kicked the passenger door open, his polished leather shoe striking the pavement with excessive force. He stormed up the brick walkway. The arrogant, untouchable commercial developer who patronized me in the kitchen just 48 hours ago vanished entirely. Trenton moved with frantic, jerky strides. He wore a custom tuxedo tailored specifically for his wedding day, but he had ripped the silk bow tie from his collar, leaving it dangling against his unbuttoned shirt. His jaw clenched tightly, a visible pulse beating rapidly against his neck. He reached the front porch, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak door, and yanked. The industrial deadbolt held firm. Trenton cursed, backing away and noticing the shattered glass littering the side patio. He marched through the broken conservatory entrance, his shoes grinding the sharp shards into fine powder. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching the camera feed transition as he crossed the threshold into the main living room. Trenton froze. He scanned the cavernous, echoing void. He registered the missing antique furniture, the bare hardwood floors, and the dangling electrical wires where the crystal chandelier previously hung. But Trenton did not care about the physical demolition of the estate. His panic operated on a strictly financial frequency. He spotted Warren standing near the center of the room, staring blankly at the scattered legal documents. He saw Brianna kneeling in the dust, her shoulders heaving with violent sobs. Trenton closed the distance, grabbing Warren by the shoulder and spinning the older man around. "Explain the bank holds, Warren," Trenton snarled, his voice echoing sharply off the bare drywall. "Explain why my primary commercial lender flagged my operating accounts for a federal review at 6 o'clock this morning." Warren blinked, his mouth opening and closing in rapid, shallow gasps. He lacked the capacity to form a coherent sentence. Trenton shoved him backward. "I checked my portfolio," Trenton shouted, his voice cracking with unfiltered panic. "The bank locked every single corporate shell entity tied to my name. They froze the $1 million we routed through Delaware. The creditors are calling my personal cell phone. I am bleeding out. Warren, tell me you isolated the tracking nodes. Tell me you did not leave a digital trail leading back to my firm." Warren stared at the floor, pointing a trembling finger at the black leather folder resting near Brianna's knees. "Amy," Warren whispered, his voice a hollow, defeated rasp. "Amy took everything." Trenton stared at the documents, the horrifying reality of his exposure finally breaching his arrogance. Before Trenton could formulate a response, a deep mechanical roar shattered the morning silence outside. I shifted my gaze to the exterior camera monitors. 5 unmarked, heavy-duty sport utility vehicles surged off the suburban street, tearing onto the property. They did not park neatly. They executed a coordinated tactical blockade. The lead vehicle swerved aggressively, cutting horizontally across the gravel driveway, boxing in Trenton's idling limousine. The remaining 4 vehicles fanned out, securing the perimeter of the estate and blocking every possible exit route. The doors of the vehicles flew open simultaneously. Over a dozen agents poured out onto the lawn. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision. They wore dark navy windbreakers, the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazoned across their chests and backs. They did not draw weapons, but their hands rested firmly on their tactical belts. A tall, stoic man stepped out of the lead vehicle. Agent Carter possessed the rigid, uncompromising posture of a veteran financial crimes investigator. Evelyn had briefed him thoroughly. He carried a thick stack of federal warrants clipped to a steel board. He assessed the shattered conservatory door, signaled his breach team, and marched forward. The heavy boots of the tactical unit thundered across the patio tiles, crushing the remaining glass into powder. Inside the living room, the argument abruptly died. Trenton snapped his head toward the entrance. Warren staggered backward. Sylvia shrieked, pressing herself flat against the drywall. Agent Carter breached the room, flanked by 4 federal agents. They fanned out instantly, establishing a secure perimeter around my family. The sheer physical dominance of the federal unit instantly suffocated the remaining oxygen in the room. Agent Carter stepped forward, his eyes locking onto my father. He ignored the custom tuxedo. He ignored Brianna's ruined rehearsal dress. He operated completely indifferent to the shattered aristocratic illusion. "Warren, Sylvia, and Trenton," Agent Carter announced, his baritone voice commanding the echoing space. "You are being placed under federal arrest." Warren raised his hands, his palms facing outward in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Agent, please. There is a massive misunderstanding. We have a family dispute regarding a line of credit. We can clarify the routing numbers." Agent Carter did not pause. He did not entertain the negotiation. He lifted the steel clipboard and read directly from the federal indictment. "You are charged with aggravated identity theft, severe bank fraud, and multi-state wire fraud," Agent Carter stated, reading the text with clinical detachment. He shifted his gaze toward Trenton, who stood frozen, his face entirely drained of blood. "You are additionally charged with international money laundering and corporate embezzlement." Trenton took a stumbling step backward. "I did not authorize the signature," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger directly at Warren. "He forged the loan application. He leveraged his daughter's identity. I merely provided a holding account. I will testify to his forgery." The alliance dissolved into immediate, cowardly self-preservation. Trenton attempted to cannibalize his future father-in-law to save his own collapsing empire. "Save your testimony for the federal prosecutor," Agent Carter replied, stepping closer. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Two agents seized Trenton by the shoulders. They spun him around, slamming his chest against the bare drywall. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room. The sound represented the absolute termination of his freedom. Agent Carter approached Warren. "My father did not fight." The patriarchal titan completely collapsed. His knees buckled, sending him crashing to the floorboards. He wept openly, tears streaming down his face as the agent secured his wrists behind his back. Sylvia thrashed, kicking her heels against the floor as a female agent pinned her arms. She screamed about her country club memberships, demanding they contact her private attorneys, her voice escalating into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. The agent ignored her demands, securing the steel cuffs and hauling her forcefully to her feet. Agent Carter stood in the center of the room, reciting the Miranda rights with a steady, rhythmic cadence. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Brianna remained on the floor. The agents did not possess a warrant for her arrest. She operated merely as the ignorant beneficiary of the stolen capital. She knelt amidst the scattered forensic documents, watching the federal authorities dismantle her life. She wore her wrinkled silk rehearsal dress from the previous evening. Gray drywall dust coated the delicate fabric. Her hair hung entangled, chaotic strands. She watched two agents drag Trenton toward the shattered door. Her fiancé did not look back at her. He kept his head bowed, his face entirely pale, focused solely on his impending incarceration. "Trenton!" Brianna screamed, scrambling forward on her knees. Her voice tore from her throat, raw and agonizing. "Trenton, do not leave me. The wedding is today." Trenton disappeared through the doorway, shoved roughly into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. The agents hauled Warren and Sylvia across the living room. Sylvia continued to sob, her head hanging in absolute disgrace. Warren dragged his feet, his polished leather shoes leaving scuff marks on the bare hardwood. They marched past Brianna without offering a single word of comfort. They marched out the door, abandoning their golden child in the center of an empty, echoing shell. I sat in my high-rise hotel suite, watching the live feed. I watched the agents secure the federal vehicles and drive away, leaving Brianna completely alone on the floor of a condemned property she no longer owned. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the suburban distance. The execution finished. The spring released. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a profound, untouchable peace settling into my bones. The federal holding facility in Lower Manhattan operated as a sensory deprivation chamber designed to crush the human spirit. The architecture consisted entirely of reinforced concrete, bulletproof glass, and heavy steel doors that slammed shut with a bone-rattling finality. The air smelled of industrial bleach and stale, filtered oxygen. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors alongside Evelyn. My corporate attorney matched my stride perfectly, the sharp click of our heels echoing in unison against the polished linoleum floor. She carried a sleek leather briefcase, projecting the formidable, untouchable aura of a seasoned legal executioner. We bypassed the standard visitation booths, Agent Carter granted us temporary access to the primary interrogation wing, honoring the sheer volume of actionable intelligence we handed his division. A uniformed federal guard swiped his proximity card against a wall-mounted reader. The heavy steel door unlocked with a deep, mechanical clank. He pulled the handle, hauling the door outward. I stepped over the threshold into the interrogation room. The space measured 10 feet by 10 feet, illuminated by a harsh, buzzing fluorescent fixture recessed into the ceiling panel. A scarred metal table bolted directly to the concrete floor dominated the center of the room. Warren and Trenton sat on opposite sides of the metal table. The physical degradation of their aristocratic facade was absolute. The arresting agents had stripped them of their tailored suit jackets, silk ties, and leather belts, classifying the items as potential self-harm hazards. Warren wore his wrinkled, white dress shirt, sweat stains pooling under his arms. His silver hair, usually styled with expensive pomade, stood up in chaotic, greasy tufts. Trenton looked entirely hollowed out. The arrogant, untouchable commercial developer slouched forward, his broad shoulders caving inward. Heavy steel handcuffs locked their wrists, tethering them to thick metal rings welded directly to the table surface. Every time they shifted their weight, the chains rattled sharply against the steel. They snapped their heads up the second the door opened. Warren's bloodshot eyes locked onto my face. A desperate, manic spark of hope flared in his pupils. He genuinely believed I arrived to negotiate. He operated under the delusional assumption that the biological tether connecting us still possessed elasticity. "Amy," Warren gasped, his voice a hoarse, scraping croak. He strained against the handcuffs, leaning over the table. "Amy, thank God. Tell your lawyer to post the bail. They froze the accounts. They confiscated my phone. You have to drop the charges. Tell them it was a misunderstanding over the line of credit. We are family, Amy. You cannot let them do this to your father." I did not pause in the doorway. I walked forward with measured, deliberate pacing. I pulled the single available metal chair away from the table, the steel legs screeching harshly against the concrete. I sat down, folding my hands neatly in my lap, keeping my spine perfectly straight. Evelyn stood directly behind my right shoulder, placing her briefcase onto the table. She functioned as an impenetrable legal shield, monitoring the interaction with cold, predatory detachment. I looked at Warren. I studied the deep, terrified lines etched into his forehead. I felt absolutely nothing, no pity, no residual loyalty. The psychological void he created inside me felt remarkably peaceful. "I cannot drop the charges, Warren," I stated, my voice projecting a terrifying, glacial calm that caused Trenton to flinch. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not operate like a country club grievance committee. You forged a federal loan document. You committed aggravated identity theft. The evidence is entirely out of my hands." Warren pulled against the chains, the metal biting into his wrists. "It was just a temporary bridge loan. I planned to pay it back after the wedding. Trenton guaranteed the returns on his commercial project. It was a victimless maneuver to protect our legacy." I shifted my gaze to Trenton. The younger man refused to meet my eyes, staring intensely at the scarred surface of the metal table. "It was not a bridge loan, and it was certainly not victimless," I corrected, my tone dropping into a lower, lethal register. "You intended to default. You planned to sacrifice my career, my credit, and my future to secure Brianna's imported orchids. You thought you could utilize my immaculate financial history to launder a lifeline for a collapsing real estate firm." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms against the cold metal edge of the table. "But you fundamentally misunderstood the scope of your exposure," I continued, locking my eyes onto Trenton. "Did you truly believe I stopped my audit at the $1.5 million line of credit?" Trenton's head snapped up, his eyes widened, the pupils dilating in sudden, horrifying recognition. I nodded to Evelyn. She unlatched her briefcase, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the sterile room. She extracted a thick, color-coded forensic portfolio and dropped it squarely onto the center of the table. "I traced the routing numbers you utilized to move the stolen capital," I explained to Trenton, enunciating every syllable with crisp, merciless precision. I pierce the corporate veil of your Delaware shell entity. I track the transaction hashes through the domestic clearinghouses. Trenton's breathing accelerated into rapid, shallow wheezes. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. "When I bypassed your corporate firewalls," I stated, watching his ego disintegrate in real time, "I found the offshore ledgers. I did not just hand the federal agents a forged deed. I handed them the decrypted data packets proving your entire commercial portfolio operates as a massive racketeering syndicate. I submitted the documents outlining the illegal kickbacks you funneled to municipal zoning commissioners. I provided the wire transfer receipts proving you laundered millions of dollars in illicit construction funds through holding accounts in the Cayman Islands over the past 4 years." The silence inside the interrogation room became a physical, crushing weight. Warren froze, his mouth hanging slightly open. He turned his head slowly, looking at his future son-in-law. Warren finally comprehended the magnitude of the catastrophic chain reaction he triggered. Trenton realized his entire criminal empire, an operation he meticulously hid from federal regulators for nearly half a decade, unraveled completely because Warren utilized a corrupt notary and sloppily forged a signature for a wedding loan. The arrogant developer built an untouchable fortress, and his future father-in-law burned it to the ground by lighting a match in the basement. The realization fractured Trenton's mind. The alliance built on mutual greed, entitlement, and arrogance cannibalized itself in a single, violent heartbeat. Trenton surged out of his chair, launching himself across the table toward Warren. The heavy steel chains arrested his momentum, jerking his arms backward with brutal force. But the restraint did not stop his vocal eruption. "You stupid, incompetent old man!" Trenton screamed, his voice cracking with feral, unmitigated rage. Spittle flew from his lips, spraying across the metal table. "You brought a forensic auditor into my network. You tied a stolen $1.5 million loan to my primary shell company. You completely destroyed my life." Warren recoiled, pressing his back hard against the metal chair, his eyes wide with shock as the man he worshipped turned into a rabid animal. "I secured the capital for your toxic debt," Warren shouted back, his own panic escalating into desperate fury. "You provided the notary. You took the $1 million. I am not taking the fall for your offshore kickbacks." "I will bury you," Trenton roared, thrashing wildly against the handcuffs, the steel table groaning under the violent, kinetic energy. He turned his frantic, bloodshot eyes toward Evelyn, his chest heaving. "Call the federal prosecutor. I want a deal. I will testify against him. I will give you the names of every local politician he bribed over the last decade. I will hand over the audio recordings. Just keep me out of federal prison." "He is lying," Warren shrieked, his voice pitching into a hysterical wail. He yanked at his chains, attempting to reach Trenton. "He manipulated me. He orchestrated the entire forgery." I sat perfectly still, observing the spectacular collapse. The two arrogant, untouchable titans who spent the last year treating me like disposable collateral now behaved like cornered rats, tearing at each other's throats in a desperate bid for survival. They shredded their familial bond, their loyalty, and their dignity, offering up each other's heads to save their own skins. I did not need to negotiate. I did not need to extract a confession. The trap closed, and the prey turned upon itself exactly as I engineered. I pushed my chair back from the table. The metal legs screeched against the concrete, cutting through their chaotic, screaming accusations. I stood up. I reached down, my hands moving with deliberate, unhurried grace, and smoothed the wrinkles from the fabric of my wool trousers. Trenton and Warren instantly stopped shouting. They stared up at me, panting heavily, sweat dripping from their faces. They recognized the absolute finality in my posture. I did not deliver a dramatic, parting monologue. I did not grant them the satisfaction of witnessing my anger or my pain. I offered them nothing but the cold, indifferent silence they previously weaponized against me. I turned my back on the metal table. Evelyn collected her briefcase, falling into step seamlessly beside me. I walked out the heavy steel door, stepping back into the brightly lit, sterile hallway of the federal facility. The guard pulled the door shut behind us. the thick reinforced steel engaged, severing their frantic, echoing screams, locking them inside a cage of their own meticulous design. I walked toward the exit, my head held high, leaving them to their inescapable fate. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept across the wraparound terrace of my Manhattan penthouse. I stepped up to the tempered glass railing, wrapping my hands around a heavy ceramic mug. I took a slow sip of my vanilla latte. The rich, sweet flavor settled on my palate, creating a stark, satisfying contrast to the bitter, toxic reality I permanently excised from my existence exactly 6 months ago. I looked out over the sprawling, limitless grid of the city, absorbing the profound, unshakable silence of my new sanctuary. The peace I enjoyed mirrored the stark, oppressive silence currently surrounding my father. Warren no longer commanded boardrooms or poured top-shelf scotch from heavy crystal decanters. He navigated the rigid, fluorescent-lit corridors of a medium-security federal correctional institution in upstate New York. He traded his bespoke, tailored suits for a stiff, standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. He slept on a thin, rigid mattress bolted directly to a concrete wall. The federal judge, reviewing the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence I supplied, showed absolutely zero mercy. The magistrate sentenced Warren to 10 years in federal prison for aggravated identity theft and interstate wire fraud. The patriarch who obsessed over projecting an image of untouchable power now spent his days scrubbing stainless steel cafeteria trays. He marched in a single-file line under the watchful, indifferent eyes of armed guards. During his mandatory recreation hour, he walked the perimeter of a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, staring out at a concrete horizon, utterly stripped of the leverage he utilized to terrorize his family. Trenton occupied a cell in a separate federal facility, serving his own decade-long sentence. The brilliant, arrogant commercial developer lost his entire empire. The Federal Bureau of Investigation seized his shell companies, liquidated his commercial plazas, and drained his offshore accounts to pay the massive restitution fines. Trenton's elite family officially disowned him, severing all contact to protect their remaining assets from the federal seizure. He received no visitors. The telephone in his visitation booth gathered dust. The alliance between Trenton and Warren completely disintegrated behind bars. They spent their initial legal hearings screaming at each other across the defense table, desperately attempting to trade information for reduced sentences. The federal prosecutor refused their deals. The decrypted offshore ledgers I handed over contained every single piece of evidence the government required. They possessed no leverage. They walked into their concrete cages, entirely stripped of their arrogance, their wealth, and their freedom. Sylvia experienced a different, equally devastating form of imprisonment. She no longer hosted charity galas or clinked crystal flutes at the exclusive country club. The government seized the remaining funds in her personal accounts to cover the fraudulent $1.5 million line of credit. Today, Sylvia navigates the cramped, suffocating dimensions of a 400-square-foot studio apartment situated on the industrial outskirts of the city. Peeling linoleum lines the floors. The radiator clanks incessantly, a constant auditory reminder of her dramatic descent. She spends her afternoons standing under the flickering neon lights of discount pawn shops. She slides her counterfeit designer handbags across scratched glass counters, desperate to liquidate the fake leather to pay her mounting, suffocating legal retainers. The pawnbrokers offer her meager stacks of $20 bills. She snatches the cash, her elite, aristocratic composure permanently eradicated. She traded her velvet sofas for a folding chair, completely isolated, abandoned by the high society friends who immediately blocked her number the morning the federal agents swarmed the estate. Brianna suffered the most spectacular, public annihilation. The morning the tactical teams arrested her family, the media crews she hired to document her flawless wedding broadcast the federal raid across the internet. The scandal went viral instantaneously. Her carefully curated, fake aristocratic social media empire burned to the ground. Sponsors dropped her contracts. Followers mocked her in the comment sections. She deleted every single digital account, forced to erase her fabricated identity to escape the relentless global humiliation. Now, Brianna clocks in at a discount retail store on the ground floor of a suburban shopping mall. She stands on her feet for 8 hours a day, wearing a rigid polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She spends her shifts folding discounted sweaters on particle board tables and scanning barcodes under harsh, unforgiving lights. Occasionally, the elite women she once desperately tried to impress walk past her register. Just last week, a former bridesmaid approached her counter, dropped a pile of clearance items onto the scanner, and offered Brianna a patronizing, pitying smile. Brianna's hands shook violently as she processed the payment. The barcode scanner beeped loudly, a constant digital reminder of her total failure. She bagged the items, swallowed her shattered pride, and handed over the receipt. Permanently exiled from the high society she sacrificed my identity to join. I lowered my ceramic mug, resting it on the sleek glass patio table. The cash I secured from the demolition firm, the liquid equity of the colonial estate, did not sit idle in an offshore account. I utilized the massive capital injection to launch my own independent forensic auditing firm. I secured a commercial lease in the financial district. I hired a dozen brilliant analysts. Evelyn functions as my chief legal counsel. We secure lucrative contracts with federal regulatory agencies, hunting the exact type of corporate parasites my father and future brother-in-law aspired to be. We dismantle fraudulent empires, operating with the lethal, calculating precision I honed while destroying my own toxic bloodline. The story of this spectacular downfall highlights a profound moral truth. Setting boundaries with toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, but the ultimate act of self-preservation. When individuals weaponize your loyalty, utilizing your stability to fund their delusions, they rely on your silence to sustain their survival. When people mistake your quiet endurance for weakness, they eventually cross a line they can never uncross. True power isn't found in arrogant displays of fake wealth. It is built through independent competence, unshakable integrity, and the courage to walk away from tables where your worth is not respected. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and sometimes the only way to win is to let the manipulators become the architects of their own destruction. You step back, secure your assets, and allow their greed, their arrogance, and their insatiable entitlement to build the exact cage that eventually locks them away. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about overcoming betrayal and taking back your power, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.